But first and foremost, a really big welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for coming along to this first of two workshops on imagining the communities of the future, which are hosted by our sponsors, Phoenix Sustainable Investments. You can read a little bit about them around the room and find out more about them. And representatives of the company are here as part of this, this conversation and debate. I think it's a very important conversation. Sorry, I should have said. Let's get the first things first. I'm Richard Astle, and I'm going to act as your sort of facilitator this afternoon. As much as possible, I'm hoping to do very little, because we want this to be a really interactive conversation. We specifically don't want it to be a series of presentations that you might take notes and leave and think, well, that was maybe worth going or maybe not worth going. We've got a lot of very experienced people in the room. You know, there's a lot of professionals in the room, so we don't need to dumb the debate down. We really want to sort of get into this and discuss how do we go about creating the communities of the future in the context of the new local plans that are emerging from both Huntingdonshire and Peterborough, and the second workshop is in Peterborough, which are envisaging communities being created going forward from today right through to the late 2030s. And if you think about all the change that we know about and the change that's coming down the track, what on earth does a community of the future look like in 2035 and 2040? How do we square the circle of all these policy objectives around, self-evidently, a housing crisis, but also the need to grow the economy and create the jobs of the future at the same time as deliver on our net zero targets, our biodiversity targets, our water resources targets. There really are a huge number of policy objectives that flow from this conversation, and that's what we want to get into and discuss. So it will be a conversation rather than a series of presentations. And I encourage us all to challenge, politely, please, and debate. And there will be plenty of time to ask questions. And also, if you'd like to use this app to pose your questions so that we can not filter them, but group them, and I know what questions are coming, and then I can invite people to raise those questions. So do use that. But I am conscious that there aren't that many of us in the room, so if you don't feel like using it and just want to stick your hand up, then we can cope with that as well. I can just about manage that process. So the outcome of the two workshops, this one here in Huntingdonshire today and the one in Peterborough in July, is around co-designing a set of principles, a guide for cooperation and collaboration, the ways in which we should all work, whether it's communities, developers, local authorities, non-governmental organisations, whoever it may be that it's involved in this process going forward. What are the principles that we should be guided by in order for us to achieve that ambition of these communities of the future? And we'll be putting those principles together with your help as a result of the two workshops, and hopefully then a process of engagement and collaboration can flow from that. Before we turn to our first speaker, can I just do the health and safety? There are no fire alarms planned, so if the fire alarm does go off, that's because there's a fire, or at least someone's concerned there might be a fire. So you need to head back down past the lifts, and you'll find the staircase just past the lifts, down the stairs to the main reception, and then we assemble outside the main reception there. Toilets, I think you're aware, are just back beyond the lifts as well. So I'm hopeful we should be able to have a safe and comfortable session. Just a word for the speakers when they're on the panel. Please do use the handheld mic. You'll probably think, well, that's fine, it's a small room, everybody can hear me. But in terms of recording and the conference, and we are videoing and recording, if that's okay with everybody, it's a much better sound if it's coming through the microphone. So I'm sure if I did this, you could still all hear me, but please don't. Please use the microphones as provided, and we'll take it from there. So, our first speaker, Lord Matthew Taylor. Lord Taylor probably needs no introduction. A Lib Dem peer, architect of the Garden Village principles, or the renewed Garden Village principles for the 21st century, and someone who is deeply versed in not only the research and the vision behind garden cities and garden communities, but also the practicalities of how they get delivered and the challenges we face in doing that. So I'd very much like to invite Lord Taylor to come and talk to us about those futures of the community, future of communities, the communities of the future, and how he envisages that playing out and the challenges we might face going forward. Thank you, Lord Taylor.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, and I think I've just got the job to kind of prompt a conversation, really. So You had a bit of an introduction, but let me say a little bit more. So I spend the great majority of my time now working on creating communities. Sometimes that's urban regeneration, sometimes that's edge of urban extensions. Mostly it's new settlements in one form or another, mainly because, as it says on there, I created the Garden Communities Programme, but actually it primarily comes from a review that I did back in 2006, a planning review for what was then the Labour government, and I've done planning reviews for all three political parties in government, or forms of government, put it that way, which was called Living Working Countryside, and I had a particular focus on rural communities. So what I'm really going to be talking about is not so much the future of London or Birmingham or Manchester, but much more the future of communities like the one we're sat in and the rural communities around them. And that started with the issues around the growth of population that we've been seeing. And there's a fundamental reason why we need more homes. And that fundamental reason is that the old baby boom, of which I'm the very tail end, sometimes actually in some versions of it I'm not a boomer at all. It took me a while to understand that my children were talking about me when they talked about boomers, by the way, but which I found extremely upsetting once I discovered what it was. I think I'd probably been happily slagging them off myself until I realised what they meant. Oh, the guy who can't work the computer, I see. But that boom in population that took place after the war up into the 1960s is now roughly my age and older. And the noticeable thing about us is that the great majority of us are still alive, and the great majority of us are intending to be still alive for some time to come. And not only that, but we're relatively healthy, and we expect to be healthy for some time to come, and we live in our own homes. Now, all of that is a population, a group of people that are already very large. There were lots of us, and we're not moving out of our homes, and that wasn't the case. 30 years ago, as a young MP, I would go to council-run old people's homes, and it was still pretty normal for people who were healthy to move into an old people's home for their retirement, particularly coming out of social housing, actually, or rented housing. It was the next thing you did. That's no longer the case, and it's a great thing. We enjoy our own homes. We enjoy the opportunity to have our families visit us. We're not institutionalized. We're all, by and large, wealthier. Many of that generation own their own homes, so they're pretty secure. And that's great, and they mostly had children. And that's why in the 1990s and into the 2000s, we had the second baby boom. There were other reasons too, but that was fundamentally what happened. So on the one hand, you've got a lot more children, and on the other hand, you've got a generation living longer than ever before in their own homes. That's why we need more homes. And people will talk about immigration, they'll talk about family breakup. There's lots of other reasons around the edges, but fundamentally, there's more of us. And looking around this room, there's more of our children, because most of you are probably old enough to have children, and your children need a home, and they're not going to get your home. So we're having to develop. And if you go back to the 1980s, we weren't expecting that to happen. The predictions were that there'd be a big population collapse. People were moving to Spain in their retirement, they were having fewer children, and we were projecting peak population decline in the 2000s. It was exactly the opposite of what happened. But because of that, plus a lot of building that took place post-war up until the end of the 1970s, we delivered enough housing. We were projecting population decline. We didn't know people were going to live a lot longer in their own homes. So we ended the New Towns programme. We doubled the size of the Green Belt because we didn't need people to be building the countryside because we had enough homes. And what we did need to do was urban regeneration. And everything was about urban regeneration. And that paid off. Go to Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, inner London, places I grew up when I was a teenager in London, the Camdens, the Islingtons, let alone the East End, they were run down then. Now they're unaffordable. I couldn't afford to live there. You couldn't afford to live there, probably. The prices that houses will change hands at that not so long ago were in multiple occupation is eye-watering. So we have to build homes, and we adjusted to that for a while by simply building housing estates around the edge of existing places, parasitic on them, using the existing services and saying, well, that's sustainable because the services are there. And it brings me to the point of today. That actually wasn't sustainable. What we did with ring places with housing estates with no services, you'll all know the problem of getting a dentist, the overwhelmed doctors' surgeries, the traffic in the streets that congests those towns and cities and villages that have had too much added to them to be sustainable. And ironically, many of the places we were adding to were actually losing services during this time, predicated on the car. You saw the workplace in one place, the shops in another place, the housing in another. We're told that housing estates on the edge of communities are sustainable because they're attached to these communities and people could walk in. But of course, they don't walk in. They're actually too far out. They're disconnected. The bus doesn't come through them because they're cul-de-sacs. The community doesn't function. So people are opposed to them. And of course, they see the houses built in the very places that in the 1940s we were telling people not to build. And the point of the Greenbelt wasn't huge areas of countryside. It was to say, we won't keep expanding our towns and villages and cities, but we would create both the regeneration of the bombed out areas and the deindustrialization of urban centres, and we'd create new towns to meet those needs. And those new towns would be full of all the services and facilities people need. But we'd forgotten that in the era where we didn't really need to build and didn't want to. So what I said in the Living Working Countryside review, and then in developing neighbourhood planning, which came out of that review, in working on the National Planning Policy Framework, delivering the MPPG, and then in a document called Garden Villages, which became the Garden Communities Programme, was that we needed to do it differently. And that we needed to stop thinking about building housing estates and think about building communities. That we needed to listen a little more to the objectors who were saying, you're doing the wrong kind of development, and think a little bit more about what the right kind of development would look like and deliver that instead. And I said, if we were going to protect our historic places, the only way you could do that was, of course, some urban regeneration, but we've done most of that, actually. But it would be to create new places. But those new places wouldn't be giant cities like Milton Keynes. They would be delivering the places that people needed to live in within their communities, because 80 to 90% of homes are bought by people who live within 10 miles of where that new home is purchased. That's who new homes are built for. They're built primarily for the sons and daughters of the people sitting in this room. And that is little understood, but it's the reality. But build a house in the middle of nowhere, and the middle of nowhere can be the edge of a town if it's too far out. The middle of nowhere can be an urban regeneration scheme if there's nothing for people to go to and use and facilities. The middle of nowhere can be the middle of the countryside if we build housing estates. So the future of sustainable development is not primarily around the eco stuff. I work in that. I chair the largest ground-sourced heat pump company in the country. The things that Carl Hick brilliantly does with Phoenix will all be part of delivering sustainability. But I chair one of the original eco-towns, what was the Snorstal eco-town, now the Carclays Garden Community. And they initially, because it said it on the box, so to be sustainable, we're going to have all of these fancy, low-carbon initiatives. And absolutely, we've baked them into what we've done. You can't create sustainable communities without that. But the sustainability of a community is not in the first word sustainable, it's in the second word community. And I point these days, I used to point to the fact that communities were historically sustainable. What were they? They were walkable. Services were within easy distance. It wasn't assumed that people had a car. The professionals and the working people all lived within the same community because they relied on each other. If you had had to isolate, everything would have been within walking distance that you needed. Which brings me to the point of isolation, and that is COVID. Because I no longer have to talk about learning the lessons of the past and translating them into a 21st century version of sustainability, where, yes, houses are low carbon, where we meet the needs of climate change, where we think about biodiversity, all these issues that we need to tackle. But in COVID, I think we all learned what a sustainable community really looks like. We all learned the importance of some green space near to you. We all learnt the importance, actually, of people having gardens, not necessarily big ones, but an outside space. Certainly, you know, there's groups of people for whom flats work. Young people first getting employment, some older people, although, to be honest, they usually want outside space, and even the young people would like outside space. What they really get flats for is because they can't afford it. What actually people want is a house and a garden. They want leisure facilities close at hand. They want to know there's a doctor's surgery and a dentist. They want to not have to use their car. Cars will be electric in the future. They won't be emitting carbon, but the streets will still be congested by them if we keep surrounding historic street patterns with houses which people get in their cars to go everywhere for. If from the housing estate you have to get in the car to go to the school, get in the car to go to the shop, get in the car to go to the doctor's surgery, get in the car to work, that's not going to be sustainable, electric or not the car. The home has to be affordable to heat. We all know that at the moment, not just low carbon. As temperatures rise, it will need to be cooled in the summer as well. It's one of the reasons I work in ground sourced heat. So sustainable communities, creating sustainable communities, comes first and foremost in not thinking we're building houses. I have sat in so many meetings where people have said we've got to build 200,000, 300,000 homes a year. And I always stop it. And I say, if you think you're having to build houses, you've already answered the wrong question. You've got to build communities. That's the exam question. And similarly, I have people who say, well, we can only build it where there's a railway station or where there's a main road. And I say, well, hang on a minute. If that's your starting point, then you're actually thinking about building a commuter housing estate and not a community. Because I want to build places where most of your day-to-day activity is where you live. It's within walking distance. You don't have to drive to the school, and we know increasingly people most of the time won't be driving to work because huge numbers of people are now home-based working, particularly professionals. The future of our economy is home-based work. The future of our economy will be the environmental industries that make the kind of community sustainable I'm talking about. Because don't get me wrong, I don't think we don't build houses to be low carbon. We do make sure that all of these opportunities are there. But if we think of it as some kind of 21st century utopia, we're missing the point altogether. What we're really doing is designing places for people. And the issue, the aberration, is actually the few decades that most of us have lived in, where we split things up, assumed you could jump in the car, assumed that it didn't matter how much energy you burnt along your way, where we thought somehow that centralizing services so that people had to drive to them was a great economic saving and would work out for people. But by gum, in the COVID crisis, didn't we learn that it isn't like that? We talk about isolation, yet people in traditional communities aren't isolated. We face old age, worrying about who will look after us. But in traditional communities, you knew your neighbours, but services were laid on where you actually needed it. So my challenge to all of you, in whatever form you're involved with places and building and delivering these homes for the 21st century, which is what we're now doing, is to junk the idea that it's about houses and embrace the idea that it's about communities and realize that in doing that, you also add value. And for those of you in development who are thinking, oh, this all sounds bloody unaffordable, the places that I work on, whether it's the Duchy, and famously in places, well, not so much Poundbury, but I always point to Nansledden in Cornwall, or the eco community, which couldn't be further from the look of one of the Duchy communities, but is built on very similar principles. One of the most noticeable things is that people choose to live in them, by which I mean they get a premium. Both of those, for example, a premium of about 15% over other house builders in the area, doing otherwise similar spaces, if I can put it like that. And they also get far greater demand, so they build more homes each year. And in both those communities, actually, they could build more than they actually deliver, sell more than they deliver, because people choose to live there. So sustainability isn't a difficult question, because we all really understand it in our gut. The technology that supports it may be changing, but the realities of what it is to live sustainably are really the realities of what it is to live in a really lovely place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Taylor, for that great way to start us off and challenge us on the issues we're going to be discussing. I'd like to introduce next Julie Farrow, who is the Chief Exec of Hunt's Forum of Voluntary Organisation. Julie, do you want to join us at the table? Thank you. Julie has over 35 years' experience of working in local authorities in the NHS and voluntary sector. The Forum itself is an independent, non-profit making charity based here in Huntingdon, Cambridgeshire. And I wondered if I could kick off when you sat yourself down, Julie. Let's see if I can get the... there we go. Just really just some initial reflections on what you've heard from Lord Taylor there. How does that resonate with your own sort of understanding of the grassroots here in Huntingdon and what people are aspiring to?
So hopefully I've got the mic right or not. There you go. Is that better? That's better. Hi there. It really resonated with me, I have to say, and I thought it was really refreshing. I really like the fact you focused on communities, because communities can only be sustainable when you talked about people. So people are our communities, not our homes. It's the people that live there that's really, really important. So therefore, you know, absolutely what Lord Taylor said was really important and really resonated with me. I thought we have learned a lot from COVID. We've learned what's worked and what's not worked. We've also learned, revolving around, you know, the loneliness factor, the factor that actually individuals, you know, doesn't matter where you live and who you are or how old you are, you can be lonely wherever you are. And being part of a community is one of the ways that actually you can overcome that, and communities can support each other. So I thought that was actually really refreshing. One of the things that I do think we need to think about when we think about homes is homes for life. So not homes that you move into and move out of as your family grows or you get older, but homes that actually can adapt with you as you age. So some homes actually, you know, and I've got a friend who lives in York and lives in a fabulous house that actually can be converted for a wheelchair really, really easily. She didn't think she needed that, and actually at the moment she doesn't. But she said to me, I know I can live here forever. It's in a lovely place. I've got a beautiful view. I've got lovely neighbours. And I know that as I age, this house can age with me. And I can adapt it really, really easily. So I think we do need to be aware of that as well. So homes are important, but communities and people are more important from my point of view.
Do you think, is there any sense that communities fear housing at the moment? I mean, I'm conscious we've got sort of, you know, local plan process going forward in Huntingdonshire and then closely followed by Peterborough. How do communities react when they hear this talk about local plans and more houses? I'd be interested in your views on that as well, Lord Taylor.
So I think that fearing housing, I'm not sure they fear it. I think they might fear the reduction in space and being able to access space. So, you know, I live nearby and I work on the Oxmoor estate in Huntingdon. Now, for those of you that know the Oxmoor estate in Huntingdon, when it was planned in the 1960s, and you know, it was planned for people not really having cars, for people being able to work. And actually, it hasn't worked because everybody's got a car, but ambulances can't get through streets. and there's developments going up all the time revolving around the green spaces that they had. I think you have to talk to communities about what it is that they value. And I think that they value the green space. And if you are transparent about why you need to do that, and you're not developing on little bits of land to make it feel as though it's been encroached on, then I don't think they'll have an issue with it. But you do need to talk to them, and you need to talk to them, but you also need to listen to them. And they need to feel as though they're listened to. And quite often what I find is that actually people do a consultation. You fill in a form, you tick a box, and off it goes. And actually, then the results come out, and actually it has nothing to do with what you've said, and you don't feel as though you've been listened to. That the things that you value actually have been heard, because listening and hearing are two different things.
So when I go back again to living, working countryside, and when I did that work, there was a view that, the countryside's full of NIMBYs and they don't want anything to happen. And yet I was meeting lots of parish councils, villages, where they knew that they needed some homes to keep the school going, to keep the shop going. What they didn't like was the way that homes were imposed on them. And my village ended up being a good example of that, because there was a glebe field beside the church, pretty much in the centre of the field, where community things had happened. But when they did a review for what might be developed, they said, oh, well, this field's near the school and near the shop, and this is the place that should be developed. So what they were going to do was put a whole lot of housing bang in the space that people most valued. When we went through a neighbourhood plan process, that was protected, but the village actually chose to do more homes than it needed to do under the county's obligations. They did them in a way that actually enabled the village to be bypassed. That bypass is now going in, so the traffic was taken out of the village. The village itself wasn't against change. In fact, it wanted some changes. It knew what it wanted, but it felt that it had been disempowered by the system. And similarly, I looked at market towns, and I was seeing people complaining that they were being ringed by houses. And I went to a town called Liskeard in Cornwall during this process, and they were due to have, I can't remember what it is now, 1,500 homes. And they were saying, we're getting estates all around Liskeard. They're completely ruining it. All the things we like about its setting and the quality of place are being lost, and we can't get anyone in the doctor's surgery. We can't get anyone in the dentist. And this is terrible, and the traffic's all jammed up. And I said, well, look, instead of thinking what you're going to get in a series of housing estates over the next 20, let's wrap all that up into a single thing. That's 1,500 homes. What if we built new Liskeard, or on the edge of Liskeard, and between that and Liskeard there was a park that you could all have, and the doctor's surgeries and the school went in to that. We built a second community that preserves all the things that you like, but actually will help your town centre shops, because they'll use those as well. And suddenly the conversation changed, not because they necessarily agreed with that particular proposal, although they did, but actually because they started to think not about how do we resist what happens because we don't like it, and it's not for us. And the usual thing was, it will only be for people from Leicester anyway, which is, I don't know why it's Leicester, but that's what everyone always says in Cornwall when you build some houses.
Interesting.
They started, we got into conversation about your children and where are they going to live. And, we're really worried about that. Yeah. And how are your services going to be provided? And what it was really empowering for them, because they started to think about what could be done rather than what they didn't want to happen to them. And I think that's a really fundamental part of the answer. So, of course people are scared, because what they often get is actually pretty crap. Yeah. And it often happens in the places they don't want it to happen. And no one's really listening to them. And I mean, classically, the consultation, none of my consultations are like that when I'm working on projects. But, I often have met, house builders who've just done a consultation, and their perfect consultation is they hide in a hotel room somewhere and hope no one turns up.
Let me come back to Julia. Thank you for that, both of you. Obviously, I think you've both touched on the pandemic already, and how that's kind of illustrated a number of things and helped helped us think harder about how we create communities. But Julie, you would have been front and centre of our response to the pandemic. I know you were, and wonderful job you and your team did. But what did the pandemic teach us about local communities, do you think, and how sustainable they are?
For me, it taught us that communities can respond and will act, that community spirit that we knew was there. When we think about those big events in our lives, we think about after the war and during the war where everybody came together and did things. I think a lot of communities where so I come from Manchester originally, so I come from Old Trafford actually, right by the cricket ground. So my community was a very small community in a really big community. We knew everybody that lived where we did, and I think that as I've travelled across the country and where I've lived all over the country, I think that some communities actually support themselves really, really well, and it needs individuals to do that. Some individuals are really connected. They're connected to their community because they've always lived there, or they're connected to their communities because they want to see things happen, because they've got children, they've got older people. And then some people actually just live in a community and don't contribute. Now, that happens everywhere, but I think the pandemic changed the way people viewed where they lived and what they did. So I think because it felt like we're all in the same place, we were all dealing with the same thing, that people wanted to help more than they ever have done previously. So they started to do things. So mutual aid groups popped up with, on streets, people would make sure, pop a little note through doors, say, are you okay? Do you need anything? Pop me a text, or put a note out the door if you want me to go and do your shopping if you can't get out. People were much more aware of what's going on locally. And I think for me that actually changed a lot. So we have, what we class as community towns, don't we? We have people who I live in a street that I don't know some of my neighbours because they go to work before I go to work. They come back after I've got back, and therefore I never see them. Certainly in the winter you don't. In the summer you probably do because you're in your garden. Really important, in your garden. But actually, if you haven't got that, you don't do it. But I think people were much more aware of what was going on around them and wanted to help and wanted to do more. And therefore we saw a real sea change in people's attitudes to where they lived and what they wanted to do. And I know that actually how people felt about their communities were really raised. They actually loved where they lived. They found a real sense of community, which they might not have felt before because of COVID. Yeah. So that was one of the positives of COVID, was actually people felt more connected in their local communities.
And can we bottle that? Can we, can we learn from that and apply it to the future?
Yeah, I think we can learn from it. I think there's several things that we can do. So one of the things that I've reflected on, and as part of my job, I connect to the whole system. So I work both with NHS, with our local statutory partners, and with voluntary organisations. And I always say, no matter where I go or what I do, please be transparent. If there's an issue, tell the community what the issue is. Don't hide it, because if you hide it, they can't help you provide a solution for it. Because I think quite often what large institutions do is actually they try and work behind the scenes. Those little legs go under, duck legs are under the water, actually trying to find a solution without talking to the community about what the solution could be. So I think that bit revolving around ensuring that they're consulting, ensuring that you're using the right language, ensuring that you're being transparent about we need homes because we haven't got anywhere for your children to live, or we haven't got anywhere for, we haven't got enough social housing, we haven't got places for our key workers to live. Actually, those are key issues for everybody. We all need to be aware of it, and actually, what can we do collectively to ensure that we actually can provide solutions for that? If you're not transparent with communities, they won't support you and they won't actually help you provide those solutions. So I think for me, that language, that transparency, being open and honest with communities about what we need and why we need it, actually the payoff might be, you might need to give up a little bit of this, but you'll get something over here instead, which will be better, and it will be better for longer.
So what does good look like? And again, I'll perhaps pose that to both of you. If we're pitching ourselves forward to the late 2030s, when some of these communities will be emerging, what does this modern, sustainable community look like? How does it feel? What's the emotional response?
So I think for me, it's something about space. So recently you'll have heard all about warm spaces, community spaces, health hubs, that, you know, the different language for different things. But I think the real thing here is about places that people can be together, whether they're indoors or outdoors. I'm not saying a village hall everywhere, but what I'm saying is spaces that people can be, outdoor spaces, whether you've got no garden, a small garden, but need to go somewhere so you can communicate and be with people. I think space is actually really important. Defining that space to be owned and supported by the community is actually really helpful and really useful. I think tech will spend, you know, it actually will be a big thing. I think when I think about, you know, the online deliveries, your food deliveries there and the other, and the fact that certain communities are having online deliveries by these little robots that go around. I think space for that, older people actually, you know, could do that. There's no reason why an older person can't get their delivery by that means. I think there are things that we can do. So I think that we do need to have space. We don't necessarily need to have space for cars. We just need to think about where those cars are going to be and how is our transport going to look, so that actually you might have your big conurbations and do you need I was talking recently with somebody in this room about a bus that goes to all the villages, and actually that's not conducive. It's great for their older person who just wants to get from A to B. But if you're working and you don't have a car, actually a 2-hour journey and then your work, it's actually not conducive to work. And I know a lot of people will be working from home, but not everybody will be working from home. And not everybody can work from home, because we still need those jobs that actually provide the services that people need.
Really, really helpful to get that expression of the importance of space there. Matthew, anything final from you on this session, and then we'll introduce the next session.
So, I mean, there'll be a whole lot of technology, won't there? So the car will be electric, heating will be electric, you won't be polluting the environment. Actually, we often get this wrong. I still talk to people when they talk about sustainability who are assuming that things are burning carbon fuels. So they'll say we've got to go to the most passive house standard on the house. And I'm like, well, there's a lot of embedded carbon in that. And if you're running on a ground source heat pump, which is using zero carbon energy, which it will be, the insulation is about the balance between the cost of running and the cost of building. It's not that you're burning fuel anymore. The car, I don't mind a car occasionally going into town for the theatre or the cinema or whatever it is that the trip's for, or because you've got to take a fridge, I don't know, whatever it is that you need the car for, if the car's not using any carbon. But I don't want you to commute into places with congested streets or fill the streets. I don't want you to be so unhealthy that you never walk anywhere because there's nothing on hand to walk to or cycle to. So, and the internet and working from home and the ability of so many more people, not all people, but so many more people to actually balance work and life better is changing the whole way in which we do things. So all of those things will be happening, but they'll be happening because the technology allows it and change is taking place. The real thing about sustainability, as I said earlier, is that you'll create a place that I often talk about it as when you're building homes, you've got to create a destination. And the destination is that when you walk out of your front door, you don't walk to the car and drive somewhere else. You walk down round the corner and you get your coffee, or you get your breakfast, or you get your paper, you go and feed the ducks, you walk the children to school, or they cycle to school because it's just there on hand. That's what sustainable living should and could look like in the 21st century. And we often work under the illusion in this country that we're Hong Kong and that there's no land and we have to go vertical. And when I did live in working countryside, 45% of all homes being built were flats. And I think I was the first person who asked the question, how many people want to live in a flat? And the answer was, which took a little bit of finding because they were a little reluctant to admit to it, is around 1% of the population aspire to live in a flat. Lots of people live in a flat because they got no choice, but it isn't where they aspire to live. And boy, did we find out why you don't want to live in a flat during COVID. So that's really what we need to think about. And just to leave you this last thought, The challenge is doing it right, not whether we do it. We have to build these homes. You wouldn't provide a school place for your child. Surely it's obvious we can't not provide them with a home. How you do those homes and where you do them and how you build them into communities they'll want to live is the real challenge. And the point I make often is this, because it does challenge people's assumptions. Outside London, in the southeast, the amount of built area, including parks, gardens, railways, roads, homes, businesses, everything that isn't fields, is 12.2%. That's the southeast, the most built up part of England. That's outside London, so we're excluding London itself. You fly over it when you're going to Heathrow or Gatwick. You fly over those fields. You see them all the time. 12.2%. And I say, if we built 10 years' worth of nations' houses, that's 3 million homes, roughly speaking, 300,000 a year to deal with the housing need. We built 10 years' worth, 3 million homes in the southeast. What would it add to that 12.2%? People start by guessing 45%, by the way, not 12.2. And then they think it will get to 45% if you built 3 million homes there. The answer is it would go to 12.9%. It's not that we haven't got room, and incidentally the biodiversity would be increased because it goes from sprayed fields to parkland and woods and gardens and all sorts of good things. The issue is not that the land isn't there, it's that we think it's not there, but most of all we think what's going to be built is going to be horrible. So we resist it, and that's what needs to change.
That's lovely, thank you. One final point from Julie.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point, and I've just come back from Istanbul. 16 million people live in Istanbul. All of them, apart from the really, really rich, live in flats. My son lives in a flat, third floor flat, has 2 children, 1 3-month-old baby, hoists a pushchair up and down stairs every day. But they are within literally minutes of shops, of cafes, of parks, because the environment that they're living in is conducive to walking. We are not conducive to walking in this country. I have a problem. I have a walking stick. I don't walk very far because I have bad knees. But there are no benches. I go for a walk and I have to really plan, where am I going? Because I've got to think, actually, is there a bench there? Can I walk that far? We don't think about those. If we want people to be happy, healthy in their communities, we need to provide things that actually are really simple, that actually encourage people to do that. So actually we need to think about those things. Accessibility as well is really important.
When people, in countries where people have traditionally lived in flats, what you find is they live in squares and corners, and it's thriving life all around them. So actually what they live is in communal gardens, basically. That's how they live. I'm
going to pause it there. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you to our first panel. I have got some more seats. For those of you standing at the back, I just wonder maybe we could all shuffle up a little bit. Julie and Matthew, do you want to go and sit on the front row? There's 2 or 3 seats at the front if anyone wants to come and sit down. Or no takers? You're happy standing at the back? Okay. Just a technical question. I'm not seeing any questions come through. Should I be? Okay. How can I see those? Did everyone just to sort of, if you want to ask questions, I mean, by all means, put your hand up. But if you want to use the wonderful technology, do the QR on this, and then type your questions in, then they'll come straight through, and I can ask them as we go. You know it works. You know it works. Excellent. In the meantime, can I invite our next panel up, and you can be taking your seats while we're doing that. And I'd also like to welcome Carl Hick, who's the chairman of the Phoenix Sustainable Investments, and he'll be joining us later. Hi, Carl. Welcome.
Thank you, Richard.
Right. Excellent. Our next session is looking, really following on from the introduction we've had from Lord Taylor and Julie Farrell there, around communities, housing, and master planning. And I've got Max, Jas, and Luke here. They're going to introduce themselves rather than me tell you who they are and what they do. And they're going to be talking about their experience and how we can sort of square this circle and think about design. I was really struck by Julie's point about space, and I think that very much plays to what you guys will want to talk about. So what I'd like to do, perhaps you could just introduce yourselves first, and then I'm going to ask the first question to Max. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Richard, and hi, everybody. My name is Max Farrell. I'm the chief exec of an organisation called the LDN Collective, which is a group of members with different skill sets who collaborate on projects in the built environment. We have about 50 members including architects, engineers, landscape designers, and specialists in things like social impact and zero carbon. And so we are doing quite a bit of master planning around the country. Ironically, for something called the LDN Collective, most of it's outside of London. We are working on sort of urban regeneration schemes in London too. I have a few other hats. I'm the president of the Land Economic Society here in the UK, which you might not have heard of because it's mainly an American organisation, but we've just opened our UK chapter, and it's about thinking differently about land economics from the environmental, social and governance point of view. And I'm also a non-exec director for an app called Wild Streets, which is augmented reality to encourage urban greening. But it's great to be here, and looking forward to sort of responding to what we've heard and to having a conversation with you all. So.
Hi everyone, my name's Jazz. I'm a town planner, an architect, an urban designer. I run a practice called Jazz Bhalla Architects. We're part of Max's very successful LDN Collective. We're a small practice, but as well as doing sort of individual houses, what we're really interested in is master planning, both from an urban regen perspective, but also strategic master planning and new settlement design, which I think is very pertinent to the conversation we'll be having over the next couple of hours. Alongside running the practice, I also do a lot of advocacy, assisting local authorities in defining what good looks like. So I'm one of the Mayor's design advocates. That's the Mayor of London's design advocates, and I sit on various design review panels for places like Essex and North Herts, where a lot of the discussion is about strategic sites and greenfield development and encouraging better quality housing from both a human and environmental perspective. So thanks very much.
Hi everyone, Luke Butcher, Director of Butcher Bayley Architects. So we are actually based in Huntingdonshire, so just up the road in Yaxley, and have another office over in Oundle, which is just across the border. I'm an architect. I grew up in Yaxley, went to school here, studied abroad, then came back for some reason to live and work in Peterborough, and have grown a practice in Peterborough, well, in the Peterborough region of Huntingdonshire, which has proven to be very challenging, to say the least. My other hats, I'm also very involved with the RIBA, so Royal Institute of British Architects. I chair the group of architects based in Huntingdonshire, Fenland and Peterborough, and I also co-chair the small practice network across the east of England. And also then locally, I'm a trustee of a local charity, the Young People's Counselling Service, which Julie might know. For another one of my hats locally.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, Max, I'm going to start with you, and really just perhaps kind of big question, really, your perspective then on what you've heard from Lord Taylor and Julie just then. How does that resonate with you? Any challenges back, or any other things you'd like to add to that?
Well, it resonates a lot, and as you might expect, because my sort of career has in many ways I've crossed paths with Lord Taylor over the past 10, 15 years even, and Matthew mentioned he's been working on one of the original eco-towns in Carclays, and before I set up the LDN Collective, I was at Farrell's Architects, and we were the master planners for North West Bicester in Oxfordshire, which is also one of the only one of the other eco-towns that's actually being built out. And that was a fantastically forward-looking programme and sort of policy framework, which in many ways, even though it was ditched by the incoming Conservative government, we have tried to adhere to in wherever we can, because it gave us some really sort of common sense principles, things like, you know, a minimum of 40% green space, minimum of 30% affordable housing, having a job for every household that was within either walking or cycling or public transport connectivity. And in many ways, this was the sort of forerunner, as well as highly sustainable homes, of course. In some ways, the environmental technology and understanding is so much better now. What I think is less well understood is that whole social sustainability. And I think that's very much what you were talking about, Matthew. And I think that the key to that is almost going back to basics. It's and this idea of 15-minute cities, which I find quite bizarre, has become quite a political issue, and people saying that they're going to be the new ghettos and things. I was at a conference recently where people actually had banners and placards saying that, which I found extraordinary. Considering as a planner, we think it's such a brilliant concept, and it's also now around the world being adopted, because the idea is very simple. It's that you have everything you need to live your life within a 15-minute walk or cycle of your home. And actually, at Northwest Bicester, we've only built the first phase, but we've built nursery, primary school, retail space, employment space. Like Matthew says, the only reason to get in your car and go out somewhere is that special occasion. And now that vehicles are becoming electric, and that trend is only going to increase, it is possible to make places environmentally sustainable. But what we really need to spend more time understanding and learning from case studies where it has worked is the social sustainability. And I think that there's so many different aspects to that, like just different types of housing for different types of people at different stages of life, different levels of income. These are all things that we need the private and the public sector to be working together on this, and that's when it's successful. Northwest Bicester was a collaboration between a consortium of developers and the council, and I think that was why it endured, actually, and I think that is always a great foundations for success, and I think that's something that's changing, and we're seeing more of.
I was going to ask you about that, because it's interesting, this question around communities, and Lord Taylor, your point there about when we talk about sustainable communities, it's the community bit that matters. But where does the responsibility lie? Who is responsible for creating the sustainable community? What would you say there?
I think it's a collective responsibility. I think everyone is responsible, and I think just back to your point, Julia, I think the existing community has a responsibility, and we were talking about the fact that a lot of the housing that we're looking to try and provide is for the grown-up children of people that are already within the community, and tends to be people within that region. But the starting point is always one of sort of mistrust, and there's a lot of cynicism, a lot of scepticism out there. And a lot of it, quite rightly so, when you do see these housing extensions and the types of houses that, the mass house builders do build. But I think the interesting thing with some of the proposals we're working on for new settlements is this idea of land value capture. So where a lot of the existing housing is being built, these sort of bolt-on extensions, which tend to be car-based, there's already very high value land because it's the next logical place for that town to grow, or it's around a railway station, and therefore the landowners have already priced in the fact that so then it's quite hard to actually build the social and infrastructure and the kind of more advanced transport infrastructure that you need. So I think the idea of a new settlement that's in collaboration with a local authority and a developer is a really interesting way of kind of making sure you capture the value in the land and provide all of the social infrastructure early on, which is critical.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. I'm going to ask Jazz next, to perhaps have your views about how do we change the status quo. I think we've kind of touched on it a little bit. Perhaps, dare I say it, most new development at the moment doesn't actually achieve what we've been describing. So what's the sort of the shift? How do we shift that gear and make things change?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really it's the biggest challenge, really. I think, because I think probably we can get some consensus quite quickly about what a new development needs to look like, but how we actually get there and how we deliver that is a massive challenge. I think I had a couple of slides that maybe I can flick through as we. Yeah, so these are just some sketches that we did for a local authority. If you go to the next one, sorry. And you can just flick through them at quick speed. But it was for a local authority trying to describe what good looks like in the context of new development next to adjoining settlement. And I think if you just pause there for a second, actually, I can just talk through some of these principles.
Max was telling me to keep clicking.
No. Yeah, don't worry about it. It's fine. Look at that. But I think there's a couple of things. I mean, these sketches we were asked to kind of provide some illustrations about what good looks like in the context of an urban extension, which I know we're sort of questioning the proposition of. But I think a lot of the principles we were espousing are appropriate to a new settlement as well. And I think the first place is the point that just because we're building on greenfields, it doesn't mean in most instances that those fields are necessarily biodiverse, very sort of incredibly rich in terms of biodiversity. I mean, we heard pesticides mentioned previously, but there's huge opportunity to retrofit some of our fields, reinforce existing green infrastructure to create biodiversity highways essentially, and use those as the kind of backbone for how we begin to structure new places. And I think then the second thing is to look at new social infrastructure, new community spaces, places for people to come together. And again, in this particular context, when we're looking at an adjoining development, as designers, for us to not think about our red line only, but in that in some senses we may be needed to create a new centre on the periphery or the edge of our site because we're adjoining another site. I think too often you'll see designers look at a new scheme and they'll place a heart in the middle of their own site without actually thinking beyond the boundaries. And how can we give back something to existing residents in a sort of walkable, close proximity? And then beyond that, I think there's a couple of reasons why this moment in time is a really important time to kind of reimagine sort of discussions around new places. I think the sort of affordability of new homes is now almost broken to the point that nobody can afford to rent or live in many parts of the UK, and so we are automatically having to turn to new tenure models in greenfield lands. So things like, build to rent is very popular in places like London, but I think suburban build to rent offers huge potential for enabling people, giving people the possibility to live in a home and actually bring together a lot of placemaking principles. Because I think one thing that might be interesting to talk about is how much of our delivery infrastructure is structured around creating houses and not developing communities or places. And we've gotten ourselves into a process where we see land promoted through the planning system, get adopted, get outline consent, get sold, move to reserve matters, get built out. And at every single one of those instances, value is extracted as the land changes hand and quality is reduced. So by the end of, your early illustration about these houses in this beautiful landscape are then just houses built by whatever volume house builder surrounded in tarmac. And how much, and we really need to begin to unpick that systemized approach to developing houses if we're to get real about, bringing forward communities as opposed to individual plots for sale. So I think if we can have a discussion around the possibilities of new housing tenures, I think that then begins to unlock different models for placemaking, because certainly as when we're working with bigger organisations, it's almost like working in a straitjacket because of the need to sell a particular type of plot where every house has access to 3 car parking spaces. And we do this madness in the UK where we build detached houses that are separated from each other by about 800 millimetres, which is in no one's interest. And I think now that we've got affordability crisis. Obviously we're aware of climate collapse. Energy is now everyone is much more sensitive. So terrace houses are there's a wider proposition for them. And I think we've touched upon the changes that COVID have brought. But I think the idea that we create these dormitories where everybody leaves from Monday to Friday, that's now not tenable anymore, because most places people are living and working in their neighbourhoods for 40 to 60% of the time, and we demand more of those spaces. So if I just ask you to flick through the end, and then I'll wrap up what I was going to say. So if we can begin to structure places around some of these principles, where we're bringing together a wider variety of places that are truly walkable, knitted around well overlooked green space, I think we can begin to question what good suburban growth might look like.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Luke, I want to turn to you now and ask you you're at the sort of sharp end of things locally. Any comments on what you've heard from Max and Jas, but also what for you are the challenges to sort of meeting these aspirations? Because I'm sure we probably all share these aspirations. It's sort of kind of a bit of like what's not to like, really, but how do we make them real, and what are the challenges that you're facing in this marketplace at the moment?
I think the primary challenge is actually just delivering it to the standard that Jas has mentioned, actually, that the way the system's set up at the moment doesn't allow any of these lovely things to be delivered in any feasible way. I'm thinking of an example. Okay, in Peterborough, across the border, the Great Haddon development, which happens to be a neighbour of, 5,000 homes being delivered in a single urban extension, which joins Peterborough to Huntingdonshire. Was planned in 2005, 6, got planning 2008-ish. Actually, wasn't discharged 2015, 16. So it's now being built out to you've got a development designed 20 years ago, now being delivered, it's all wrong. Phase 1 is 700 houses, no schools, no community infrastructure. They weren't going to be living in phase 2, then I was saying something in phase 3. And I think the way the development economics is set up at the moment locally, probably not nationally, but particularly locally, because of the demand on housing and housing target numbers, I can't see a way that being changed in the next 15 years. I think 2040 is 17 years away, which 2006 I think it was. So if you look at how things were delivered in that development in 2006 when it was designed, it's the same problems we were facing then as we are now in lots of ways.
So we're not future-proofing then, are we, in a way?
Not at all, no. And I think there's a big issue locally about engaging local communities, local individuals, organisations, businesses who actually want to design and deliver better places, but it's left in the hands of volume national house builders who have no engagement with local communities, won't pick up the phone for our business, for example, and want to engage with us on these issues we want to talk about. We just, whenever we try to have that engagement with them, we approach them and say, look, we are, we are local. Let's take the Great Haddon example. I can see it from my bedroom window. You can't get more local practice than us. We don't want to talk to you. And you think, but we understand the community, we understand the issues are, there will be no engagement because the landowner has devolved that responsibility to, in this case, Countryside Homes, Persimmon Homes, Barratt, Bovis, all the big players, and then don't want to engage with us. You might get the piecemeal at the end to come in and fix a problem at the end. Can you come and help this local charity who's coming to fix a problem? Where I live, Yaxley, it's a village of 9,000 people, which is not a village, but it's still classed as a village. It's had urban extension after urban extension after urban extension, and it's a broken community now. I think it's got one of the highest deprivation rates in east of England, actually, particularly Huntingdonshire. It's up there with the Oxmoor estate. It used to be a thriving village. It's been destroyed through these sort of urban extensions. I grew up there. It doesn't unrecognisable to what we are now. But when I see the local plans being put forward now, it's the same as what they were being proposed 15, 20 years ago. And I don't think there's political will to fix that. Right. So actually, to design better places, we need political will to do that and to stop listening to volume house builders.
Yeah. So the worry we've got there is that what will be produced in sort of 2040 is what we've planned today, and therefore take no account really of what we're going through in terms of that sort of revolutionary change in communities.
Yes, the plan for say 2040 will be delivering communities that are built in 2050 to 2060 based on the pattern of development. And say the Great Haddon example is a great example of where the landowners held up the Section 186 groups for nearly 15 years. They refused to agree to it till the council said, OK, you can have what you want. By which point the council had already spent the money that they'd been earmarked on other things. So there's no money left for that development, which is just the way things are built.
Council's probably got no one still working for the organisation from when they first started the discussion. I mean, it's a really good question because I think I read a stat the other day that in 2021 we delivered of 50% of the homes we delivered nationally. Of all the homes we delivered nationally, 50% were delivered by the 15 largest organisations. So all the aforementioned organisations, and they're all being bought up by Vistry. So one organisation to rule them all. Yeah. But I think one of the things it's so important for other ventures, like Phoenix or other sort of developers to demonstrate that a different proposition is profitable, visionary, viable, and if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. Because I think you need a carrot and stick approach. So we need a much more better resource planning system that when we see proposals come forward that are generic, that for want of a better term, don't exemplify beauty. I think we need to move beyond the proposition that beauty is a value judgment, and actually it's a set of KPIs, key performance things about walkability, about mix of uses, about engagement, social value. I think that's how you can define what beauty represents. And that's the kind of stick approach. Today's status quo is no longer tenable, and then also a carrot approach that demonstrates a different model that is more collaborative, that is denser, richer, will actually generate more value, both for local people and for those bringing forward development.
Thank you. Lord Taylor, you wanted to come in with a...
I just wanted to pick up that example of your community, because when we think about the long term, we tend to think about the environment in the future and what will the new technologies be. But actually, the single biggest bit of the long term is, at the moment, we tend to go for 5 years supply. We'll add another 100 houses here. Each 100 houses is added to meet an immediate need. They're thought about as if they're the last 100 houses, and then once that's been thought through, it's the next 100 houses. And the landowners, because they know that it's a sequential process of growing the place, know that you need to have their site. So they will resist the extras. They'll hold out because they know eventually you're going to have to allow, which is exactly what you described. So what you actually have to do is take a vision of what the places you would like to see in 2040. If that village, you'd said, it's not going to be 100 houses now, 100 houses, 100 houses, 100 houses, 100 houses. It's going to be 1,500 houses or 2,000 houses. How would you do that? Well, then, of course, you'd have a school and a doctor's surgery, and, of course, you'd have shops, I hope, and, of course, you would plan it completely differently. And, in fact, you might not put it there. You might do it in a new settlement. And, of course, if you had the option of a new settlement rather than just on the edge, you can't be held to ransom for your on-the-edge site. I always say with new settlements, the great thing, it's a challenge for developers, but the great thing about a new settlement is the council doesn't have to say yes. It can always say no, because there's another place and another place and another place it could be. Okay. So they have to compete to be the best possible option. Whereas if it's the next 100 houses on the edge of the village, they know you're going to get whatever they're going to offer you.
Luke wants to come back in, and then Wally's just... I'm going to throw another question to you all there, just in terms of that future. I mean, we're currently planning, still, as far as I can see, on a car-based society. But here's a question. I mean, will we all have cars in 2038, 2040? What's your thinking as architects and designers? Should we still be planning for a car-based society at all? So in terms of the kind of revolutionary thinking we need. So Luke, you go first, and then let's come back to that.
It's just building on something Lord Taylor said, and I was just thinking about, what was it? I've just gone. Your question's thrown me.
Sorry.
Thinking about a question instead. No, actually, it was political will, actually, and thinking of, again, Peterborough, probably not Huntingdonshire, where, if you look at the original new plan development for Peterborough in the 70s, there was planned to be a development at Castor. And the fourth township was never been built because the local council, which is Conservative, happened to be usually had the leader in Castor. So for 30, 40 years, they've managed to stop the development of Castor. It's got a dual carriageway, it's got all connections of development. So what they'll do instead is they'll pick on a Labour ward or somewhere else on a neighbouring different district, but there's no community to stop it. So I think unless almost politics is removed to an extent, in some communities, I think you're going to constantly have this issue of where development's placed probably in the wrong place because it suits that politician to be voted in to not be doing that in their back garden. Okay. If I go to the question of transport, I can't see a path forward regionally but doesn't rely on the car to an extent. I think the communities are too dispersed. There's not enough transportation in terms of buses, trains, and in fact, it takes an hour to go from between Peterborough and Cambridge, which is only 30 miles, is madness. Let alone if you're in a rural settlement. I think our community will have to still rely on a degree of individual transportation. I think also it's sort of now ingrained in society. I think people expect to have it. I think there's a question about the number of cars. I think we're a one-car household. It's hard at times, but you make it work. Interesting, it's because I can ride a bike. I'm fit enough to ride a bike. Questions are, when I'm a bit older, will that work? I was talking to Julie about this earlier. Maybe not. So I think, in short answer, I think we still need to design for the car. I think it's a question of how many cars.
Okay. Yep. Jazz, Max, any thoughts on that?
I completely agree with that, and I think there's been a lot of progress made in terms of movement and how we get around, just in the last few years even. And I think it's about minimising the need for cars, and so a lot of the master planning that we're doing and the new settlements that we're master planning, it's all about how do you reduce the need to go on those long trips, essentially. And again, that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is by having everything within walking and cycling distance, but also making it pleasant to walk and cycle and safe. And so the other thing that we're doing now is planning what we call mobility hubs. So these tend to be located around a new settlement, And it means that when you have heavy goods vehicles, which are very much needed because we all use the internet to buy goods that we expect to be delivered to our door within 24 hours. So the heavy goods vehicles would actually stop on the border of a town, and then they would break down their deliveries onto e-cargo bikes, and that would mean that you can have narrower roads within the town, but it also means it's safer for children to go out and cycle because you're not worried about them getting mowed down by a lorry. And these things are really important, and I think reducing the need for trips outside of a town, but also changing people's behaviour and attitude, and that I think is going to take a bit longer because I think that's a generational thing as well. Like there's a younger generation who don't expect to own a car, let alone drive a car, and when they do drive a car, they'd be happy to share a car. And that is very different mindset. And I think I went to a really interesting round table recently. It was at the Garden Communities Conference. In fact, Carl, we were at that round table, and I thought it was really revealing because they'd done some research around them trying to encourage people that rather than having that additional car parking space, they could have an extension to the home, a home office. And they surveyed people expecting the majority to come back and say they would like the home office. But actually, the majority wanted the additional car parking space. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And when they drilled down into it, they realised that the people that were doing the survey were provided information by their sales team saying that the house would be worth more with the car parking space than it would with the home office. And actually, when you don't give them and that's not true for a start, but that was influencing their decision. And I think it's this nudge kind of and giving people the right information, helping change mindsets. When we did Northwest Bicester, we made it so that people had within their kitchens, they could see when a bus would come to the bus stop and they'd know how long it takes to walk there, so they could plan, things in a much more seamless way. I mean, we can do that now on an app easily, but it's about kind of providing the right information and the options and making it more convenient for people to change their behaviour.
Thanks, Matt. Do you want to finish off for us?
Yes, that sounds like you were interviewing a lot of boomers, maybe. But it was just to add, I mean, obviously everything that was said previously makes an enormous amount of sense. And I think when we talk about what car-free settlements might look like, I think we automatically assume something quite radical, and I think you can do lots of small things that the aggregate of which is a very radical outcome, but actually any one of these individual things, like a little LED screen that tells you about when your bus is going to come, we can do them tomorrow. And I think a settlement designed around access to a car versus the kind of settlement we have at the moment can be radically different. So at the moment, if there's a family of four with two parents and two children aged 21 and 18, I think there's an expectation that you'll have to have 4 cars on plot. And whereas if that's reduced to 1 car and possibly access to another shared vehicle, the amount of density, the typology you can bring forward is radically different. And I think it's about embedding that kind of thinking and to Max's point, about what the journey from A to B looks like via bike or walking, which is really critical. And that's something at the moment that in too many new settlements we are really, really poor at. And actually it's amazing that I think we could play like new settlement bingo. We haven't mentioned highways authorities yet. And I think I think one of the engagement with highways authorities in too many councils, I think, needs to be massively improved to kind of tackle that A to B for alternative modes of transport.
Definitely. Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much indeed for that session. We could go on for a lot longer, and hopefully the conversation will keep going, so I'm sure you've spotted some thoughts for our next panel members, but thank you very much indeed. Great stuff. Thank you. Well, I'm not seeing any questions on the chat, so I've got my own, so don't worry. Do you want to? Yeah. Does everybody want another chance? Aha. There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Trevor. I knew you'd get there. I think I'm going to come back to this one around the communities that exist. I'm probably going to ask you that question, actually, Trevor, so thank you for asking it in the first instance. Great. Can we have our next panellists up, please? We've got Daniel and Matt, I think. So this session, we're going to be looking specifically at how we live within our natural means, or indeed can we live within our natural means. And our two guests, let me just flick onto this, are Daniel and Matt. from Water Resources East and Wildlife Trust. So again, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then I'm going to perhaps pose a couple of questions for them. So Daniel, welcome.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Daniel Johns. I'm Managing Director of Water Resources East. So Water Resources East is a small independent not-for-profit company formed and tasked by government to create a long-term water resources plan for the whole of the east of England. So how do we make sure there's enough water for housing development, the growing population, economic development, food production, green hydrogen, and importantly, environmental restoration and the changing climate. So quite a task, a small team, but we work very closely with councils, the water companies, with farming representatives, energy companies and others to create this whole plan.
Brilliant, thank you. And Matt, welcome.
Hi, I'm Matt Jackson. I'm from the Wildlife Trust. I'm the Conservation Director for the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. Now Lord Taylor has left, I can disagree with some of the things he's said and perhaps inject a note of grit.
You could have done that anyway.
Well, I would have done.
Yeah.
Not a lot of grit. There's an awful lot that I agree with that's already been said. The key point I was going to disagree with him about was his assumption that new towns will automatically create new biodiversity. I think they can create new biodiversity, but that revolves around good planning and preparation and thinking very carefully about those new communities, where they sit and how they operate. And sustainability is complicated. He said we know what it is, but I think actually it can be very convoluted. I've just driven up here from in an electric car, but nowhere to charge it once I got here, but that's a separate issue. Driven up here from Cambourne, which was a new settlement which jumped over the green belt, so protected the green belt, but created all sorts of problems in doing that. But from a biodiversity point of view, is a very positive settlement. It's an area, I've walked around it long before it was developed, have seen it develop over the years, and hand on heart I can say that there is a lot more biodiversity as a result of Cambourne having been built. Equally, it had a single carriageway road when it went in. It wasn't very long before that had to be a dual carriageway because everybody got in their car to drive somewhere else from a town that at the moment doesn't have a train station. That may be coming. And the other thing I was going to disagree with slightly is about eco-towns, but I hasten to add, I know North West Bicester very well, and it's a fabulous place. Western Otmore, which was going to be just down the road, which was going to be another eco-town, was certainly going to have all sorts of challenges if that had gone forwards. And when I say I disagree about eco-towns, it's about the process. What eco-towns did, for those who don't know, was it was a scheme to bring forwards new settlements, principally new settlements, that were had a different vision about them. And the vision was great. The process was awful, because the process that was offered was, it bypassed planning. It was a request to developers to put forward options for new towns. Western Otmore was actually a site where a large warehouse developer had bought up options on an area where the A43 joins the M40, so a prime distribution location, saw an opportunity to bring forwards a housing development and pushed very hard for what would have been an awfully unsustainable development. North West Bicester, on the other hand, was, as you say, fully supported by the local authority, brought forward as a planned development, interestingly, as a sustainable urban extension. So a good example of where that can actually work, rather than it necessarily being a bad thing. So I don't automatically agree that new settlements are the only way to bring forwards a positive vision, but it's challenging. And I think the thread for me is about good planning. I represent the biodiversity sector, and we always say we're not anti-development, we're pro-wildlife. We're not interested in arguing about development for development's sake. We're interested in A, protecting the best places for wildlife, and B, promoting wildlife as a benefit from development. And it can be done, but it's very challenging. The other thing I would just add as a note of caution is, although Jazz, I think, said that greenfields don't necessarily hold a lot of biodiversity, that's true. As I said with Cambourne, classic example of what were 4 oilseed rape fields largely before the development went in. Now a big local nature reserve, all sorts of positive outputs for biodiversity. But the impact of increasing population doesn't just sit within the site. So somebody said earlier we need to think about the red line. Wicken Fen, not a million miles away, Wicken Fen has to close parts of it during the summer because it's overrun with people, because it can't cope with the number of people who come to visit it. So when we're thinking about providing spaces for wildlife, we need to provide spaces for people so that the wildlife can coexist as well.
Brilliant, really helpful. Thank you for that, and thank you for disagreeing. I like that. We want more of that, more challenge and gentle argument. Daniel, I'm going to come back to you though, if I may, and you know, from your point of view, I think probably most of us got a sense of how water is becoming an increasingly topical issue in all of this. Do you want to give us a little bit of background? I mean, how big an issue is it, and what are the challenges we face going forward?
Well, I think the title of the session is actually right. So if you flip back where you were.
Sorry.
Yeah, just living within our natural means. It feels like we've been talking about the environment for a long time, been trying to develop sustainable communities for a long time, but it feels like now the environment is starting to bite. Those constraints are starting to kick in, whether it's to do with water resources, just not enough water to go around within the driest parts of the country, whether it's to do with nutrient neutrality, you know, just too much nutrients within our water courses, preventing so many from achieving good ecological health, and also thinking about flood risk management and sea level rise, the impacts of too much rainwater falling at once with the changing climate, going straight into combined sewers, and then flushing sewage out into rivers, which has now become such a massive political challenge. And what all that's about is decades of not considering water when putting forward new development. Let's say, you know, new development using too much water, too much fresh, you know, potable drinking water to flush toilets and to water our gardens, too much nutrients going straight into the combined sewers, out into water bodies, and say, you know, too much rainwater falling onto hard surfaces, going straight into those same sewers and causing storm overflows. So just, sorry, now Richard, just in terms of what our regional plan says, if you go on to the next slide, I mean, this is the overall picture. This is the kind of summary, I suppose, of a draft water resources plan that we published last November, which covers the region, as you can see, right up to the Wash, up to the Humber Estuary, the Wash, then down to Suffolk and Essex. This is the driest part of the country, receiving on average only about 2/3 of national rainfall. And we're projecting a massive deficit in water supplies by the time we get to 2050 because of the need to restore water bodies to good ecological health. We're taking too much water from ground and surface water sources. We need to hand that back. We've got a changing climate, which means that even though there's going to be wetter winters, we're going to have drier, hotter, drier summers. And for the east, that's a big problem because clearly it's not just about housing growth, it's about food production. You know, this is the breadbasket of England. We've got massive amounts of food production, really productive agricultural land, but only if you irrigate it. And we're seeing farmers having to irrigate cereals at the moment, as well as kind of fruit and vegetables and other crops. Unless we get a handle on this, we are going to be constraining agricultural production. We're going to see the wetlands and other wildlife sites, the Suffolk, Norfolk Broads, really struggling in that changing climate. And we're going to see kind of constraints impacting on housing developments. And Cambridgeshire is one of the areas in the country where that's really going to come to a head, and probably most quickly. Well, I mean, I won't talk through. We do have a plan. I guess we do have a plan which goes through to 2050. There's lots of infrastructure investment in major reservoir projects, particularly the one near Chatteris, which people may be aware of. Also, one further north near Sleaford. But by the time you get to the 2040s, we are talking about desalination. Even if you tackle leakage, you press down hard on leakage as much as you can, roll out smart metering so everybody is on a metered tariff, paying per cubic meter on the basis of what they use. You will still get into quite energy-intensive options around desal for the east of England in particular. And just flip on one more slide. I think I've only got one more. And that's why, as well as investing in demand-side action, we have to bring new sources of supply on stream as soon as we possibly can. So major reservoir projects, 2 within the region, as well as desal and reuse. It's probably not a question for this, because we're not challenging. No one seems to challenge the kind of the thesis that in order to solve the housing crisis, it's purely about supply side. And again, it's probably not a question for today, but what more can we be doing on the demand side to make homes available to people who need to live in them, where they want to live, but to, I don't know, just to kind of clamp down on the amount of kind of speculation and kind of houses being seen as merely an investment for the future.
I think it is a question for today. I think these are all pertinent questions, and actually one of the reasons why I asked that question earlier about who's responsible for creating sustainable communities. You know, is it the developer? Is it the local authority? Is it the individuals who live there already? Is it the individuals who come? And the same with these two questions. You know, how do we live within our natural means? Is that all the problem posed by big bad developers or under-resourced local authorities? But what's the role of the individual? I think it is a pertinent question about how we manage demand and the role of the individual in helping biodiversity as well. So let me come. Thank you for that, Daniel. Let me come back to you, Matt. I mean, do we actually need to confront the elephant in the room? I mean, is this actually compatible? Can we do the levels of housing? I mean, you know, Lord Taylor explained very clearly why we need more housing. You know, it's not something that someone's made up for the sake of developers. I mean, we all feel it. You know, I've got 2 children who simply can't afford to get on the housing market. I'm sure many of you have too. But if we're going to build that amount of housing, creating the communities as we do, or the other way around, create the communities, the housing alongside, is that compatible with biodiversity net gain? Is it compatible with our ambition to double nature? Is it compatible with the water we have? And I guess sometimes I wonder whether we're just sort of skating over the surface of something that doesn't work. Matt first.
Well, oddly, I think it is as much more, if not more, a question for you, Dan, than it is for me. To go into the detail of what you're talking about, in terms of biodiversity net gain as it's framed in the Environment Act and how it's coming forwards, I don't think there's a problem so long as we develop in the right places in the right ways. And a lot of thinking is going into that at the moment. We are developing locally our nature recovery network strategy, thinking about how that will happen. There are issues about biodiversity net gain, and we need to remember that it's predicated on damage, that it's the biggest gain comes from the biggest damage. That's how the system works. So we have to be very careful about making sure that BNG doesn't undermine our protective systems. So there are some challenges there. And when we had the original biodiversity offsetting trials, we were seeing decisions coming forward, very few, but some decisions which were saying, oh, well, there's going to be a net gain, so it doesn't matter what the damage is. That's exactly the wrong way around. That's not how you should be thinking about this. It must be about protecting the best places and the most important places first, and then thinking about how we can buffer and improve those. But done the right way, as Lord Taylor explained earlier, there is a lot of undeveloped countryside out there. There is some of it which is not highly important for food production. However, there is still a great challenge around loss of greenfield and food production sites. And in this area particularly, we're losing soil. We are losing soil at quite a rate. In the fens, we reckon we're losing around 1.5 centimetres of our peat every year. That's a shocking statistic. You can go and stand in the Great Fen and watch the soil blowing away. On a windy day, a dry windy day, you can literally see clouds of the soil blowing away. We need to address that, and to do that we need to be quite upfront about some of the other challenges. We need to be careful about not offshoring our food production in a way that isn't sustainable. We need to be very careful that we're not putting too much stress and strain on our countryside. And as part of that, we may need to think about what we eat and how we eat going forwards. I think that's somewhere where we need to put an awful lot more thought, and actually there is going to have to be some change. But your fundamental question of whether we can live within our environmental means with a high level of house building in this area, the answer is yes if you do it right, but the biggest challenge is the water challenge.
You guys are great, carry on.
Oh, well, I think taking that the starting point, so the ending point was absolutely correct. We can do it if we design it in the right way, and we design better. And I think what we're talking about here is individual homes that use as the least amount of potable water possible. So we are displacing use of drinking water with capturing first rainwater, capturing recycled grey water, and using that in the home for non-potable uses. We're thinking about at the kind of a plot or community scale, capturing rainwater for the community, cleaning it, and again using it for kind of irrigation, using it for washing cars, all those kind of uses of water that don't need to be at such a high standard. And we're also thinking about, obviously, using sustainable drainage systems integrated within the community so that they not only provide a flood risk management function and stop all that rainwater just flooding the combined sewers and causing sewage to be discharged into rivers, but you're using that to store the water maybe as a way to recycle it back up the stream to again use within homes. So this isn't a challenge that cannot be overcome by clever architects like the ones we've got in the room. But I guess one of the problems with, as Jace said, is that you can have a master plan which does all these beautiful things, but then as it goes down the track from the master developer to individual plots being let, the value goes down and the density of housing goes up as individual developers kind of creep into those different areas that previously were going to be set aside for sustainable drainage systems or for kind of rainwater harvesting or whatever it happens to be.
Okay. I've got a question, Luke.
I was just thinking actually about working locally and how the challenges we've come across with water and wildlife. Interestingly, even on small scale individual properties, SUDs we come across quite regularly, sort of like the middle level, won't engage on things like green roofs and because they're not in their toolkit of things they can look at, which is daft because they've been around for such a long time, which means we can't then get any benefit from them, so it disincentivises the homeowner to put it in the first place because there's no benefit. So we can go about proposing something which then because the system's broken, I won't then incentivise them to do it. So I think that seems like a really quick fix around things like green roofs. Which also then hope there's also biodiversity gain from that as well, marginal. And I think then also on the biodiversity issue, I think that all the problems we've had on biodiversity have always actually been on small sites, interestingly, where we've been bashed by an ecology officer. I think unfairly at times, and then but on the big, you drive past a big site, you see them just putting all the trees up. So it almost feels like there's two standards as well, in working the area locally, but one for the big developers who can do what they want, and one for small little businesses and homeowners who have to jump through all these hoops. I mean, interesting as well. I think from a water standpoint, I find it really perverse almost. That because you have this sort of almost notional boundary drawn in some areas where, again, middle level starts to bend. On my side of the road, I'm not on the middle level, but the other side of the road, they are, which means they have a different set of rules applied than them. Actually, the water's probably all still coming from the same space. It's all going to the same place. It's like at some point, someone's drawn a map and gone, that will do. Say for FRAs, actually, we're coming from an FRA map, which we know is wrong, but we can't challenge it. Even though we know it's wrong, because we've been told that we will never win against the Environment Agency. So I think there's a whole...
So structural issues again.
Structural issues
Yeah.
to solve, which might help in some incremental changes.
Let's just thank you. Just Trevor want to ask his comment as well, and then we'll ask you to address both those points together. Trevor?
Yeah, mine's on a slightly different, but I think that there are connections with it. I'm excited to see new things like this that clearly help communities individually and collectively. I'm visualising a pipe coming from that nice new reservoir, springing leaks almost as soon as it leaves that new universe. How do we, I guess not you, ensure that all of this clever thinking and innovation looking to these future healthy, sustainable communities doesn't get or doesn't let the water companies off the hook in terms of historic and current waste at astronomical levels as a consumer when you read about it. You look after every drop, or you try to. I just wondered, have a view on that, and I think there are linkages between missing the point sometimes on some of this.
Yeah.
Okay, Daniel, go ahead.
I mean, just on the first point around sustainable drainage systems, I think part of the challenge has always been about a developer were to build them, integrate them into the development, who's then going to take on the ownership and then maintain it over time. Hopefully, with Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, the government has said it will now introduce Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, which originally entered into the statute book in 2010. So it's only 13 years late, but certainly that's now going to be introduced, which hopefully will give local authorities the the resources to be able to approve the design of sustainable drainage systems, which presumably will include green roofs, including on community centres as well as individual properties, and will create the regime by which there is like a long-term ownership and maintenance of those assets so they continue to perform as they should, because otherwise they just get kind of clogged up with litter. You know, a crisp packet falls in and it just doesn't work as it should. But just on the reservoir project, I mean, firstly, I really hope, and one of our roles is to try and make sure there is as much public value being delivered from this £2 billion investment in the Fens landscape. And we talked about this before, about this will sit within the mid-level commission system. And so one of the ideas and one of the options is to bring water to the reservoir using open channel transfers, which of course sits and fits with that Fens landscape, which is riddled by drainage channels all over the place. So bringing water to the reservoir through using open channels, which delivers a better biodiversity gain than you would if you were building underground pipelines. You integrate it with kind of wetlands around the outside, perhaps, which help polish the water to a better drinking water quality, to a better raw quality, so that the water company has to spend less time, fewer chemicals, treating it before they put it into the reservoir. And then, of course, on the leakage side, it actually has to be said that the companies in the east have much better leakage performance than companies elsewhere across the country, because we're in the driest part of the region, because regulators have been hot on the companies in the east in particular. They've got much lower levels of leakage than perhaps places like Thames Water or United Utilities or elsewhere.
Fascinating. I'm going to bring this session to a close, but Matt, perhaps could I invite you. If we get this right, what do these communities look like in terms of our sort of symbiotic relationship with nature? Perhaps paint us a picture of what success could look like.
Yeah, the answer is it's going to look different wherever it is.
Sure.
And I think that it sounds trite, but it's true. And it goes back to my point about good planning, but good biodiversity planning as well as good master planning. They should be one and the same thing, but they aren't always. That isn't always the case. And I think we do have to be aware of the differences. It's not about applying a single solution. Water's slightly different again because of the scale of the issue, and I think you do have to think big when you're thinking about water. But when it comes to biodiversity, we need to think about what works locally and what works best and what fits in. And it just goes back to exactly that issue of good planning. We have a problem with sufficiently well-qualified, well-trained ecologists within local authorities. They've almost disappeared. It'll be interesting to see whether BNG and some of the other things that are going on at the moment start to reverse that trend. I hope it will, but at the moment it's a very low-level input. So it's going to be different wherever it is. I think there's a lot we've learned over the last 20, 30 years about maximising our use of space, and there are really good things that can be built in that are good for people to use and good for biodiversity. Some of these urban corridors where you actually build in the hedgerow with a rough bit of grassland, with a SUDS system. You mentioned SUDS. We do know that SUDS can be good for wildlife. There's a site on northwest Northampton, Upton, where that was designed very much around a SUDS system built in, and the local university has monitored it over the 20-something years since it went in, and we know again there is more biodiversity as a result. It's worked better than we thought, because the worry really was actually about kids chucking stuff in it and it being full of shopping trolleys and so on, because it is literally down the middle of the street. Actually, it's worked pretty well, and it does integrate pretty well into what was yet another sustainable urban extension. At the time, it was the thing, but we do know that has been much better for wildlife. So those sorts of multifunctional spaces. But as I say, you have to be very careful about believing you can build it all in there, because we are putting our countryside. Lord Taylor talked about 12% of the countryside being built on. In our part of the world, less than 3% of it is designated as being important for wildlife, and I think you have to bear in mind just how much strain we're putting it under, and we've got to be upfront about reacting to that.
And I think that's one of the things we miss as well, don't we, in the current policy world, is that we plan for some of the hard infrastructure, the housing and the enterprise zones, the sort of the industrial zones, but we don't actually plan where we want the environmental areas, where we want the best farming land is. We don't actually have a strategic plan for all land use, which I know is something that is being discussed, but I think would help in this context, I would have thought.
And, I mean, just last word for me, I think what I've drawn from this conversation we've had over the course of today, bringing in what I would say about what good master planning looks like, is if you've got an area, do you draw the homes in first and then try and retrofit on that how the SUDs are going to work, or how the biodiversity improvements are going to work, how the rainwater recycling systems are going to work, or do you build in the social infrastructure from the outset? Do you build in the sustainable drainage from the outset? Do you think about biodiversity net gain based on the assets that you've got and the opportunities to enhance that to really maximise those scores, and then retrofit the homes within that overall kind of environmental master plan?
Well, let's throw that one quickly to Max. What's the answer?
Well, our starting principle for any master plan is that landscape is the primary infrastructure. And I think if you have that in your mind, and everything that you set out to do, you'll have a much better chance of it being sustainable and actually giving back.
Brilliant.
But it's amazing how many people don't do that. To answer your question, it tends to be the other way around.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Well, thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Matt. Very kind. Thank you. I think we're starting to see a number of themes emerge in the conversation. And Trevor, I am going to come back to the point about existing communities because it's vital. Well, we've got another panel discussion next, and then we're going to have a kind of open house where we discuss, what are the principles that we need to adopt if we're going to achieve these aspirations for the communities of the future. So I'll be encouraging everybody to participate then. And then we'll have a few words from Carl Hick about his reflections on the event and on Phoenix. And then there will be opportunity for networking, and there's some food which will be coming through that door. So if you're all well behaved, you'll have a chance to eat and drink a little bit more within the next hour. So I hope you've all enjoyed the first session. I thought it was very thought-provoking, and thanks to all the panel members and the speakers. And I thought there were some interesting themes coming through, particularly about the importance of good planning. And I don't mean that just in terms of the good planning department in a local authority. I mean just overall how we strategically think and plan about our future. And I think we've had a bit of a session on master planning and design. We've looked at natural resources, but I guess this bit to me is the sort of the heart and soul of it. So there you go, guys, set you up nicely. This is the sort of the human element, or not that Julie wasn't talking about the human element in terms of communities too, but I'm delighted that we've got Natasha, Leanne and Trevor with us. And again, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in just 1 second. And really this focus on the health of communities. And I guess, it's interesting to see where the panelists go with this, but perhaps a better word is the thriving. I don't think of it just about public health and making sure we all don't get colds and we all exercise, but literally places where people can thrive and live worthwhile lives. So let me stop talking and ask our panel to introduce themselves. Natasha, do you want to go first? I'm sure it will be in a second.
Is that better? Yeah, great.
Well done.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here tonight. Thanks, Richard. So I'm Natasha Reid. I'm founder of Matter Space Soul rather than Mind Space Soul, but it's along the same lines.
I'm sorry.
It's along the same theme, so it's fine. It's all fluid. And so that's a design and research consultancy specialising in shaping places for health, well-being and social sustainability. And I've been doing that for the last 10 years or so. Originally trained in architecture and urban design, but I'm a sort of an ex-architect now, I suppose, in that zone between people and place. And I have a second hat. For the last year, I've been working partly within a local authority through the public practice programme, which places built environment professionals into councils to build capacity. So I'll share a little bit of the work that I've been doing that sort of crosses over across those two worlds. So yes.
Thank you. And Leanne,
hello.
Did we get your company right?
It's people think it's an acronym. It's not an acronym. It's the word MEND. So hi, my name's Leanne Hartley, and thank you for having me this evening. It's great to be here. So I'm director of MEND, and MEND is a social sustainability consultancy for enabling social outcomes, or the best social outcomes, to be levered through the built environment, whether that's through procurement or design or planning. I'm also founder of Urbanistas, which is a global network for amplifying the voices of women to make cities better for everyone. And I started that 11 years ago this week. And most recently, I started an initiative last year called Consider Urbanism and Placemaking, which is all about fostering more kind and more human-focused and human-oriented places and lived experiences that recognise and respect the diversity of the people using them to enable us to move from car-based urbanism to care-based urbanism. So I know we've talked a lot about how we move from car-based urbanism. I've also got other roles, including I'm on the Mayor's Infrastructure Advisory Panel. I'm also on the government's High Street Task Force, and I'm a built environment expert. But all of my work has basically got a social lens on the built environment.
Brilliant, thank you. And Trevor?
Hi. Oh, that works. Yeah. I'm Trevor Gibson. As you can see there, I work for PECT, which used to stand for something, but we just use the word PECT now. So answers on a postcard. My role within PECT is business development and fundraising. Intriguingly, I was thinking as I sat there listening to the speakers, the panelists earlier, I've been fortunate, I think is the right word, of seeing the challenge of, the opportunities of, if you like, communities from the public sector. I worked at Peterborough City Council and a number of other councils before that for many, many years. I then saw it from the private sector, working for a local economic development company for 5 to 10 years, I think it was in the end, and then subsequently, currently working for PECT, heavily involved in communities now, but from a very different third sector perspective. And PECT, just so that you're aware, it's a sustainability charity, so we're involved in all aspects of sustainability, from the green environment to energy to healthy, active lives, food, you name it, we're involved. So again, we interact with communities on a number of levels and through a number of agendas. So thank you for the invitation.
No, you're very welcome. So Natasha, perhaps I could start really with posing a question for you, if I may. I mean, sorry, I've lost my question, so I can't do that. What should we aspire to? What is it in the future that we can aspire to in terms of the sort of the health and the sustainability of our communities, and what does the best look like?
So I have some slides
really?
prepared to hopefully answer that question, and it's going to be a slightly radical start, and then I'll show another slide about how that's being implemented into action. But what I'm going to put forward is that we need inside-out thinking for life-centred places, and this slightly builds on what Lord Taylor was speaking about earlier, about moving away from thinking about creating housing, but actually creating communities. And what I mean by this is by really starting to understand first how places affect us, because our environments impact us. There's more and more evidence and research around this in terms of our quality of life, our health, how places make us feel, how we can build community, kind of have sociable places, and even our own sense of sort of identity and belonging. It impacts in so many different ways. And it is very critical in terms of health, not just a nice to have, but actually the difference between some of the most deprived and the least deprived areas can be 10 years difference in life expectancy. So it is really fundamental. And yeah, there's so much research that has already gone on and more that's happening within the sciences. So as part of my work, I've been getting in touch and working with people working in environmental psychology, which is specifically looking at how spaces affect us, but also neuroscience. So there's research looking at how spaces affect the way that our minds work and our stress levels. So all sorts of studies about spending time in green spaces and how that really does lower stress and support us in so many different ways. And also the way that, say in anthropology, there's lots of work around how we create relationships between people and different sizes of groups that you can form, and how we can start to translate that into the way that we create spaces based on just the really fundamentals of sort of being human, I suppose. So it's all things that I think we all innately know, and there is evidence around that as well that exists, and it's sort of bringing that together and bringing that into the world of design, making people more aware of that so that it can be used to create better places. And yeah, essentially the starting point is just our human needs and really understanding that, how we live, how we want to live, and then shaping places from that basis, which I think seems in a way quite obvious, but it's not the way that things are happening at all. So sometimes I sort of wonder, I'm like, am I saying something that's really new? But actually it's not happening. So that's the kind of revolutionary side. And then the next slide is how do we make that happen? So that's something I've been working on over the last year. So I had previously developed a sort of framework and a model based for designing places based on the human experience of places. And this is something that I've brought into local authority I've been working in Brent, actually in London. And it's called the Place Quality Framework, and it's a toolkit to basically embed a set of design criteria that are fully based on how places impact people, and that will become part of planning requirements. This is for residential spaces, and it's almost like a small pilot for how things can be done differently. And it focuses on health and well-being, on community and belonging, and also how to create vibrant and inclusive spaces. And I won't go too much into all the details of what that includes, but it's everything from having natural spaces, spaces that encourage social interaction, where that could be as simple as having benches where people can sit and have a chat, to more communal spaces, or having places that are making sure that places are welcoming to all different types of people, whether that's older people, for women, making places safe, a whole range, spectrum of kind of needs. So yeah, it's kind of the first step towards creating these new benchmarks to actually demonstrate how a development will benefit people as part of the planning process. And the last point on there, actually, it's about individual health, it's about community health, but also about nature and sustainability, so planetary health, and that gets woven in, and trying to bring those things together, because I think there's natural benefits, particularly from green infrastructure and people's mental health and making people active. So, yes, that's it.
Really interesting, and I think a lot of that is at the heart of that is pretty humanising, isn't it, in a way? The way we look at things, and I agree with you. There's a number of times when you look at a development and you think, well, who on earth thought that was a good idea? And you think, is that really radical of me to think that, or actually, where's the humanity in it?
Yeah, it's like things have just been made without thinking that this is our habitats, basically, that we're creating, and it's more from that perspective of how do you shape it around us as human beings and communities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that. Leanne, if I could turn to you, I was looking at your website earlier, and it says, as a company, we love cities, and we think the way we live, work and play in them could be improved by making the way we design, make decisions, and manage the built environment become more socially responsible, which I was intrigued by, and I wondered if you could expand on that. What does social responsibility mean in this context?
Thank you for the question. And goodness, somebody's read my website, which is always good to know. Thank you for reminding me that I'd written that. No, I laugh, but it's something that means quite a lot to me, and the reason that I started MEND in the first place. So I started MEND back in 2010 because I was really excited by the prospect of the National Planning Policy Framework as then, to elevate the role of communities to be active decision makers about what goes on in their community. And that to me was really exciting. Up until that point, I'd worked in regeneration and planning for major organisations, and I was lucky enough to start my career in the very early noughties, which was the sort of the beginning of the urban renaissance. And I spent a lot of time working on regeneration projects where the focus was very much on raising land value and very much on changing the physical fabric of those places, which of course was really important. But for me, what was missing was this social transformation. How these developments and how this investment and how these projects were transforming the lives of people living there. And to me, that was what was missing from the work I was doing. Not necessarily from the Urban Renaissance project itself. So I decided I wanted to work on projects that were about that sense of social fabric. So mend, as I chose the word mend because not only, well, it wasn't about fixing broken places, for sure. For me, it was about mending the connection between people and their place. I mean, it goes deeper than that. It's about mending the social fabric of the place because I think that's its most precious commodity. But I also think that our development models, our urban placemaking models, in recent decades have actually eroded that sense of social fabric. And what I think we need next is an approach that prioritises that. Because for me, places are largely social networks. They manifest physically. We can touch them, we can walk through them, we can see them. But beyond that, underneath that, they are social constructs. They're uniquely human. Humans make places, but they also make us. So I resonate very deeply with what Natasha's talking about in terms of our places need to resonate with our human needs. And at the moment, forgive me for being blunt, but they seem to accommodate the needs of cars much better than they meet and accommodate the needs of people and our environment. So returning back to your question about social responsibility, I feel that we, when I say we, I'm talking about myself, and I'm talking about myself as a built environment professional. I feel I have often an overprivileged role in making decisions about other people's places. And for me, I feel really strongly that my job is to be careful with other people's places. And that means listening, it means talking and engaging, but it means doing that on an authentic level. Not simply about giving some people some choices that I've created from my professional experience and asking them to rubber stamp one of them. That isn't what engagement should be about. I think what we fail to often realise is that there's a wealth of knowledge, experience, skill, understanding, history, culture within our communities that if we were able to extract and use, would better enable us to create the sort of environments that Natasha has just painted a picture of. But we often overlook that wealth of experience within our communities. And by doing that, we squander it as a resource. So for me, and this probably is quite radical, I believe that actually we should be seeing communities as more of a client. We should be elevating their role to more of a client. We should be treating them more as a client. Because essentially, when we're developing in a place, we're effectively taking an episodic view of that place. And what really needs to happen is that place needs a client of its own over the long term. Because I think another issue is that we have very short-termist approach to how we develop. And the sort of things that Julie was talking about, the sort of things Lord Taylor was talking about, require long-term vision. They also require us to deeply unpick the fundamentals of why we build. Why do we build? We build because we need to live together in a community. That is how we've survived to this point in time. And given the challenges that we face, not least climate change, that is one of them. We also have social justice issues. We also have economic disparity issues. Those three fundamentals are going to challenge us going forward. So we need to ask questions about how we want to live next. And what kind of urban form, place form, settlement form do we need to accommodate those challenges, but also to live a life that we want? You know, it's easy for us to get bogged down in how awful this sounds, but we need to live and thrive in our communities. How are we going to do that? We need to go back to basics and understand and choose why we choose to build. And that is why considerate urbanism and placemaking is important from my point of view, because it starts to answer those sort of questions. It puts humans first, how we want to live next, and how we want to engage with each other. Because social responsibility isn't just about making decisions, it's about how we live together. It's how we form that civic and that social fabric. It's how we act and behave as citizens. And I think maybe now is the time to start to reimagine and re-envisage and remodel what citizenship means. Because I think it's become tired. So if we want people to engage in the planning process, then we need to help that process. We need to We need to empower people. You can't expect people to turn up to a town hall meeting, put their hands up and contribute if they don't have the confidence to do that, if they don't feel that they're going to be heard. If we want people to inform what the next urban settlement looks like, then we need to be bold enough and kind enough to envisage that together, and that requires civic fabric. So our places need to make sense from a physical point of view. They also need to make sense from a social point of view.
Brilliant.
I'll leave it there.
No, that's really good. Julie wants to come in, so please do.
Yeah, thank you. Save my voice, thank you very much. I've got a question for you revolving around, so I really like to hear what you said, and you're talking about communities and how they act and how they need to be empowered to actually have a say. How can you ensure that communities can design the services that they need at a level that they need it? So we know, don't we, that we're in a cost of living crisis right now, and I know we're looking at how do we design the future communities that we've got, and we know that actually we've got a growing population, we've got an ageing population, certainly in Huntingdonshire we've got an ageing population, but how do we ensure and empower communities to have a say about how services are designed and are effective for them in the places that they need, when we know we've actually got constraints coming down the line? We know there's not enough money to do the things that we want to do now, and there'll be even less in the future. So how do we do that?
Leanne, over to you.
I feel it's really important for me to be honest and say when I don't know the answer, because I don't. And I do think that there's things we can learn from product design, and there are service design organisations out there that are dedicated to co-designing service delivery in collaboration with communities. And as I said a minute ago, we're all members of a community. We're all professionals. We're all here today because we've been selected, because we have interesting ideas and interesting perspectives. We're all members of our community. Are we saying then that we wouldn't have something to contribute if somebody asked us that question? I think we would. So I think we should be brave. I think we should have a go. I think we should ask people what kind of services they want. And we might be surprised by the answers. But the important thing is to then act on them, isn't it?
Excellent, thank you for that. Can I let Trevor in first, and then I'll come back to you, Max? Is that all right? Yeah, otherwise he'll get upset. Trevor, I mean, I don't know whether you wanted to reflect on anything you've heard there, but the question I was going to pose to you, in addition to that, was around the role of the individual. You know, I've been trying to hint at this all along. I mean, where are the roles and responsibilities? And if we're going to deliver these communities and the aspirations that we've heard, particularly from Tash and Leanne there, what's the role of the individual in all of that? And I'd like to put onto that your question, what about existing communities as well? Because actually some of the challenges we face are easier managed in new communities than they are in existing communities. So just in 2 minutes, Trevor, if you could.
Okay. I keep switching it off, I think. Yeah, lots to take in there, aren't there? But I'll start at the end in a way, and it's been reflected by panelists here and others that have spoken already. There's a huge responsibility with master planning, with planning on whatever scale, because you might be thinking 40 years ahead, but you can't predict with any accuracy, as we know from recent events, what's going to happen in that 40 years. So there's always an inherent danger in that, and I think therefore building flexibility in whatever that means when one talks about hard infrastructure, but future-proofing it and building that flexibility in to cope with those challenges, some that we can predict to a degree, some that will just come and hit us, is the way forward. One of the concerns, which was my question earlier, is that a focus on new communities sort of, I don't know, relegates, if you like, the multiple existing communities and the inherent power, which was mentioned earlier, that communities have, that knowledge, that experience, the resource of just people able to help one another and do things. And I think there's a way perhaps that we could, I like the idea of building that better engagement. Looking back into my public sector days, and Richard will recall much of this as well. We've worked together a long time on things. It doesn't always result in the actions. We have the ideas, and everybody looks at them and says, that makes absolute sense. When I look back, did things change in any transformational way? Maybe not. That's for another day. But I think there are still ways in which we can work with communities and organisations like Julie's and PECT and others that work in communities. And if you like, are dealing with the impacts of all of those previous decisions in many ways, not whether it's government, local authority, or just things that happened. But you know, we pick up the people that can't afford their energy, or don't know how to eat healthily, or can't afford to eat healthily. And you know, I think speaking to those organisations at an early stage, as well as the individuals, but every community is different, as well as the individuals and other stakeholders, also engaging them in that design process. I know it happens, but engaging them meaningfully in that design process, we might stand a chance of building these holy grails, if you like, of these healthy, sustainable community places.
Yeah, thank you for that, Trevor. I know Max and both Jazz wanted to come in there, so Max, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment on Julie's question about how can we empower communities more and in a better, more meaningful way. And Leanne, you said that she didn't know the answer, but I think the answer was in your brilliant speech that you made, because you said at one point that we should start to treat the community as the client. And I think that's a really interesting shift of mindset, because neither the public sector nor the private sector seems to think that way at the moment. There's this adversarial relationship between the councils and the developers, and the community are that sort of interfering, keep them out of the way for as long as possible in the background. Actually, if you treat the community as a client right from the outset, and what that then means is that you provide them with all of the information that they might need to make the decisions. And that goes back to what Matthew Taylor was saying about that example you used. I can't remember where it was, Matthew, where there were certain alternatives, and then they started creating their own neighbourhood plan. And because they could see the benefits that might come from a certain amount of housing development, then they actually ended up promoting the idea of having more homes. So you almost, if you turn it on its head, you never know what the outcome's going to be, but you can be sure that you'll have less animosity and less wasted energy and you know, the social fabric that you're talking about.
I think this idea of the community as client is really interesting, actually. Jazz, did you want to come in, and then Carl as well?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, not for the first time today, Max has said what I was going to say. But
excellent, thank you. Thank you, Jazz.
It's just the point that I think we sometimes in our work, we come across developers who have quite a derisory view of what the community might want. Well, if you ask them, they're just going to say, can we have 3 terrace houses, a football pitch, and an upside-down swimming pool? And actually, if you give people, if you have an informed discussion about these are the ingredients, you actually get quite meaningful feedback. And I think for us, I guess, as designers, it's about kind of, we have many different clients, like the community being one of them, and then the actual client who pay our bills. And so it is about sort of being diplomats and kind of demonstrating that social value and commercial value aren't necessarily opposites. Like, especially working in parts of central London, some of the most valuable places and most sought after places are served because they have special character, or you know, certain communities live in them, and actually it's bananas that you wouldn't then speak to those people to try and harness some of that those assets, and then celebrate them in new development. And yet you see that happening time and time again, and I think just there's a million reasons to be negative at the moment, but one of the things to be positive is just the fact that how far the conversation on social value has come in such a short space of time. Like, you know, 3 years ago I'd never used those 2 words before, and now it's like in everyday lexicon.
Well, that is encouraging. Carl, did you want to come in?
I think one of the things that I kind of, you look back at things and you look at where communities can end up, and then you look at things like artificial intelligence and where that may lead to. And obviously you can be quite impressed about what that might lead a social fabric, but when you look at some really the clever brains in, like Jeffrey Hinton and people, we've got some of the top brains, clearly looking at future developments, we can't help but look at AI and how that's going to affect the future that we live in, because it's not that far away, and within 10 years there'll be masses of AI, and metamorphosis of change, but I do think that that needs to be controlled, but other countries are going to embrace it. So if you don't embrace it quickly, you're going to miss out. So there was a lot to
Yeah. Well, I think it takes back to the sort of point Leanne's making there about if you do adopt that mantra of the community as the client, then you will embrace that technology, but in the right ways, because you're thinking about how it enables the community rather than how it disempowers it. I think that's right. Ashley, you wanted to come in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, go for it.
And actually, it's a bit of an add-on to Carl's point as well. So I think my team, we specialise in development strategy, and we've been using, I'll say data analytics as part of our urban design process. And this is for a district-wide clean growth strategy, which is there obviously to fundamentally deliver sustainable developments for the future. What's been really interesting about that process is that once you put in the criteria, fairly obvious, you go through the process and you're trying to define where growth is best placed. So within this district, it's an incredibly large area. And the point I wanted to make is that by using technology and using outcomes that you're trying to achieve, actually what it told us is that the local plan is not quite right. Now, that might seem reasonably straightforward in many respects, but actually if you think about the local plan process, which is predicated as far back as you might like on simple criteria, two things. One is a map defining what can happen and where, and equally what can't, and then policy that defines what you must achieve or what this development must achieve or must not achieve. And that starts to question lots of fundamentals about how you bring forward sustainable growth at scale, be it a garden community, be it urban regeneration or whatever, because they start to fundamentally challenge each other. And in fact, we unlocked that the aspirations of one authority through its local plan process was completely unachievable because it undermined its policies to achieve net zero, for example, as its policy criteria. Complicated reasons, but nonetheless. And this is where I think it also gets interesting, because everything that's been a brilliant discussion that we've all had so far, but it's largely embedded in the middle area, which is about design and ideas, whereas strategy and implementation, the delivery of outcomes, are the real challenges. So if we're all going to step out the space that we're familiar with, we need to start at the end, which is, so what are we trying to achieve? What are the outcomes? You define those, because there is no the solution, there are lots of solutions, if that makes sense. Find the outcomes, because we're only going to evidence that we are bringing forward sustainable change if you can measure it. Therefore, you need metrics that you can evidence as part of being able to move forward in a much more sustainable way. So that's about evidencing change. So you need to understand what those objectives are to be able to bring them to the front, to define your strategy, to bring forward the development that you want to bring. Because otherwise, it's just like the definition of madness.
Yep.
You know, continue to do the same thing over and over again and hope for a different outcome.
And I think that's what we're hearing, isn't it? That that step change is absolutely required. And how do we break out of that box? So I'm going to come to you in a second, Catherine. But what I might do is I might sort of skillfully, well, you'll be the judge of that, sort of merge together this session and the final session. The final session is really about, well, what are the principles that we need to adopt if we are going to achieve this step change? So picking up a little bit on what Ashley said, and I wondered if I could tempt you to actually use the technology. Go on, give it a go. And actually be using that to write in there your thoughts on what those principles might be. If we're going to do this step change in thinking to achieve the aspirations for those communities of the future, what are the principles I'm looking for here? The principles, I mean, I think Leanne's already given us one nice soundbite there, not just a soundbite, I didn't mean that to be derogatory, around, the community as client is a great idea. What else do we need to have in our sort of list of principles that will allow us to collaborate and cooperate and co-design those communities of the future? So perhaps we could be doing that while we start to open up to more general questions anyway in this final session. So Catherine, I'm going to come to you in a second, and anybody else now wants to chip in as we open the debate up. But what I'm then going to do for the panel is say to you, what would be the one principle that you would want to see enacted if we're going to achieve this step change So I'm going to leave that with you. I'm going to come back to you in a second. So Catherine, off you go.
What I was going to say, yeah, I actually lived in Huntingdon, and 30 years ago, we were thinking of where to live for a family, you know, where we're going to move to. I thought, oh, we'll live in a nice, detached, rural place in a village. But we had met some German friends and said, no, if you're having children, you want to live in the centre of the town where you can walk anywhere. 30 years later, still in the same house, 3 children left, no car, walk everywhere, walk here, walk to the train. But more important for me, I can walk to good quality green space. I'm actually from natural England and very value the importance of green space. And you know, we've actually got a triple SI on our doorstep, which I think really value. But I was going to say, you know, as principle, we've all heard, you know, social whatever cohesion. And I think living in a terraced house is a real plus. But the other thing is being that green space and having a good block of green space where you can walk to and the value. And we've all talked about, you know, the climate crisis, it's the biodiversity crisis, that this principle can help to unlock.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got the opportunity, you know, not fiddling around with a hectare of green space here, to really think of big, you know, the great thing, the Wickham vision, to think big, and that's really addressing our big, you know, issues of today for the next century.
I think thinking big is absolutely order of the day, isn't it? I was just going to pose a challenge to Julie, if I may, because we said we'd be challenging. I've got, you know, some experience of community engagement for housing developments, and maybe I just do them really badly, so that could be the conclusion. Fair enough, okay. But very seldom do I get to the point where I can have that really rich dialogue about social responsibility and community assets, because the door is absolutely shut in the face from the first approach. We do not want this development, so therefore we will not discuss it with you until it's gone through planning. And therefore all those conversations that you wanted to have about where the green open space should sit and what amenities and the cohesion and the health are simply impossible at that stage. So is there a need for communities to grow up a little bit and to be more responsible and more responsive and to engage in that dialogue?
Yes.
Thank you. It's not just me.
That was the right answer. So the answer is we all need to grow up and we all need to have grown-up conversations. I think you don't need to treat communities the way they've been treated in the past, as idiots.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know, actually having a grown-up conversation with communities is really important, because if you ask the right questions, you'll get good answers. It's not, you don't treat them as if they're idiots. Don't treat them as if, yeah, we're going to do that, I'm going to ask you a question and not do anything about it.
Sure.
Actually, it's about being transparent. It's about being open. It's asking open questions about, actually, and then giving them a, well, we've got to do this. This is the rationale about why we need to do that. Give them the information that they need to be able to have a robust discussion about what it is you want to talk about. If you do that, you'll get answers. You'll get solutions you never even thought of. We've got some people in the room that I know actually have created solutions to issues within local communities because they've actually asked questions and they've listened to those answers and they've treated people as grown-ups, because we haven't treated communities as grown-ups.
Very good answer. Sorry, Lord Taylor.
I just wanted to support that. I talked earlier about, you know, the ideal house builder consultation being looking at hotel room, no one turning up, please. Everything I do is the opposite way round from that. From the neighbourhood plan I talked about, which is the one you referred to a controversial scheme on the edge of Truro for developing a hillside that had a supermarket proposal, it had housing proposals, everyone was against the idea. What we do is really reach out to the community and bring them in a genuine way. Some people call it inquiry by design, some people call it charrettes, but it's actually being willing to genuinely engage, because on every occasion what you find is people are more intelligent and more interested once they get past the we don't like it and into real dialogue. I mean, on that hillside in Truro, which we ended up getting permission for, we took people out, we did a summer barbecue festival thing for people to come and see it, look at the plans that we were doing. We took people out in the back of tractors on trailers, probably health and safety risk, but they absolutely loved it. And what we ended up was with people who arrived to oppose it, saying they'd really like to live there, and could they put their name down for the development. Later at Carl Clay's garden community, we took people on Land Rover rides around the old play tips and had kite making and fly your kites with your children. So I think there's a willingness to really engage. I actually run a customer panel for water companies. Strangely enough, water companies aren't very popular at the moment, but we do quarterly meetings for the customer panel where anybody can turn up when it's online, and when they register and come into it, they become part of the panel. They don't even know that's going to happen. They kind of think they're going to watch it, and you have a kind of co-panel of the panel members who are independent customer reps, but they're not really customers. But they are real customers who just turn up on the day, and they transfer from coming online to have a real moan about pollution or whether their water's working at home or whatever, to a really strong engagement in the issues that the water industry is currently facing, and what do you do about the investment to make that work.
Thank you.
It's courage that actually people need, and not be frightened of people.
Yep, fair point. Yep. Jacob and then Helen.
Firstly, I can't get anything of the app because signal's not great here. Apologies, that's my principle. But
Thank you.
building what Lord Taylor's touched on, I think that's the thing about the assessments. You've got to plan for the community that isn't there. You're planning for the community that's going to be there. And so, certainly on the projects I've worked on historically, one of the things that I've sought to embed in those processes is embedding the structure for that community to engage, because people will move in, and you need to think about how those people are going to engage over the lifetime of them. Keeping people moving on day one, who on a few projects I've worked with called pioneers, people who go there first, and actually like it to live on a building site in some respects. I think it's badly delivered. There are ways of doing it. It's about both creating the social and the physical infrastructure, which touched on earlier, to make people engage. And it comes back to the answer to Julie's question about how do you think about service design. It's using commissioning answer from these budgets happening. There are some great experiments happening nationally around that sort of stuff. But use that thing that you said, that is the challenge. If you are thinking for a new community,
Yeah.
you've got to build in how that new community can engage and plan for that to happen, if that makes sense. It comes back to this idea of, as Jack's mentioning, about the being built places difficult to do that. You've got to build in that future flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jacob. Helen.
Thank you, Richard. Helen and I, local resident, also an officer at Cambridgeshire, the local nature partnership, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, so two hats on that my local hat on. Yeah, all of these issues, none of us have got answers for, have we? And there are some technical instruments which have been used in the past, which you might argue are not being used well, haven't been used well, and are not fit for the future. I often think that our brains go towards what we think the answer is, but that actual community piece, we lack capacity of people who understand the value of social sciences. We lack the capacity of people who have that broad skill set to recognise the investment that is needed to build capacity within communities. And I think if you're an outsider looking in, I think that concept of building capacity within the community is really brilliant. Both Julie and I here were part of the local COVID hub and supplies, which is the market town just over there, a population of about 17,000. So we saw firsthand what was happening within our community. And what was very clear to me was that there was no locus of control within the community, and the organisations that were helping the community, particularly around older and vulnerable people, were all outside of the area. So we worked to tackle the care issues and the security funding and built a model, and that's moving forward, but very, very slowly, to relocate that locus of control around a voice for the So how can we build resilient communities? I don't know that there's any one answer, but it's finding a sort of an approach, it seems to me, that fits within a community, that works for that community. So in St Ives, I often think it's a catchment-based approach, because there's been lots of experience, lots of knowledge. We're an area high risk of flooding, and it seems that water is going to be probably one of the key issues there. You might argue that for the whole of the district, for the county, for the East of England. But using water as that kind of golden thread that runs through everything is something that everybody can get behind, and is not, it's one of those common things. So I think it's a really rich discussion here. It does concern me a little. This is a lot of outside people going, we want to build houses. But I think what we've illustrated here is that it's hugely complex. There's a huge amount of professional skill. There's the technical engineering side, which physical has up with numbers and people throw complexity at it. The social science, which is softer, which not so many people understand, but is absolutely vital to get right.
Brilliant.
You don't have enough ecologists, you know.
Thanks.
So anyway, thank you.
No, Helen, that's really powerful commentary, so thank you for that. Right, I'm conscious of time, always. So I've got Julie and Luke, if you could keep your sort of comments reasonably brief, and then I'm going to come back to the panel for their final thoughts and their sort of words of pearls of wisdom. Okay, so Julie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment about the capacity issue in communities. Our communities are thriving in our area, whether it be Huntingdonshire, Peterborough, Cambridgeshire. We've got thriving communities here. We're in touch with 800 plus community groups just in Huntingdonshire, and there are thousands more within Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And from my point of view, investment in them has never been enough. When COVID was here, there was an excess of money to enable new groups to actually kick off and do things, because there was a demonstrated need. But actually that's gone now. There's now no money. There's no money coming from government into the voluntary sector to enable that to happen. And what we need to do is actually recognise that actually, if you want a community to be engaged and involved and to have a say, you need to ensure that there is something in there. So whether it's actually a framework, when you say you're designing a new community, that actually you start with community. What do we need to do to enable that community to take an active role? How can we build that capacity? Is it parachuting in somebody who's got the experience and the skills to build the capacity within the community, so then they can take it on themselves and move forward? But actually having that as a principle, actually, you need to invest in that community for them to be able to do something.
Lovely, thank you for that. Luke?
I think my point was also about, it's similar to Julie's actually, about if a community is a client, also using the resources of people in the communities and the skill sets of professionals in those environments already, rather than relying on parachuting in services, when actually the people who know the communities best already live their work there. But ironically, they're always working 30 miles in another community, ironically. We're all sort of playing this sort of game of we work 30 miles away from where we live, but actually we'd rather be working on our doorstep. So I think if there was sort of general restructuring about that, I think the place we get would be a lot richer, because you're already in the community, so you probably understand it better, or at least you're a step forward for someone else who's coming in parachuted in.
Lovely.
Who all over the world isn't going to be having that same experience.
Okay, thank you for that.
It's not necessarily about that for me, it was about the skill element. So we know in Cambridgeshire in particular, we have a real workforce issue revolving around actually people with the skills that we need within our communities to deliver the services that we need. We've got a huge issue in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough revolving around that. So actually, having somebody who can maybe mentor, and there are different approaches that you can take.
Well, I think ironically some of that is because there's been this skills have left the area because you haven't invested in the people in our communities in the past. So therefore you can't really keep them in and retain them because they just go out somewhere else. So
Lovely.
So I think it is all linked together actually, just investing in people.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to the panel now in the reverse order. So Trevor first. Some final thoughts and your sort of key principle that you would advocate if we're going to take this forward the right way.
Yeah, I'll combine that in a way, because the word I kept writing down when I was thinking what to say was the word connection, and I think there's a relevance to that. There's the physical connections we've talked about, but recognising that buildings don't make communities, but the type, quality, positioning of those connections within a community are critical. I think we've heard and agreed that. I think the holistic, connected view, to use that word again, is not to look at community issues in isolation, recognizing the connection between the environment and health, the economy and the environment, recognizing that holistic view. I think that's more likely to engage people rather than, piecemeal impacts about green space one day, health another day, and so on. So I think there's another key connection there. And then I wrote down the power, we talked earlier about the inherent power of communities. I think there's something also about networks, connecting these new communities with old communities, both in terms of just building those linkages, but also building the mechanisms for learning, for collaborating, and perhaps co-creating some of the future solutions. So, it is about connections at the end of the day. So.
Lovely, thank you, Trevor. Leanne.
Thank you. Hi. It is. So, gosh, in a nutshell, I think a key principle for me would be I'd like us to flip the process. So rather than this being a physical process which has social outcomes in terms of placemaking, I think we need to turn it into a social process that has physical outcomes. And a second principle, I know you only asked for one, but it's riffing off what we've just discussed, and the lady at the back there, which is we can't expect communities to behave like a client unless we give them the resources and tools and capacity. So community coaching, in the same way you coach an individual to transform and develop new skills, grow, and be motivated and set vision and goal. I think we need an element of that coaching style applied at community level. So I'd really love to do that next.
Really nice. Thank you.
So sort of carrying on the building community capacity, I think it's so fundamental in terms of skills, but also we need to think about how people can actually afford to devote that time and energy, and who is able to do that, and how we can make that happen for more people. But if we can, what would be great, and what I want the principle to be, is that I was talking about the outcomes for people and how that can be a way to measure the success of development. And I think that should be rooted in what the community wants and needs, and it comes from that very specific context. So joining those areas up. So yeah, that's my ending
really
principle.
Good. No, thank you so much for that. And I would encourage you all, please do send in your principles. If you can't get the technology to work, then email them in afterwards. So you've got the email address through the invitation, and we'll be probably in touch with you directly to encourage you to do so. Because I think what we've heard there, some really good thoughts about what those principles should be. And if we get those right, then we have more of a chance of achieving the step change that we require. So can I thank our panel very much indeed. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invite Carl Hick to come and join us up here. And we're just going to have a sort of final session, if you want to stand down, guys. I'm just going to ask Carl a few questions for his reflections on today, and then we're going to finish in about 5 minutes, Carl. So we should be okay, shouldn't we? Yeah. So, Carl, I just wondered, if I go over here, I just wondered, Carl, your own reflections on what you've heard today and around how we go about achieving the aspirational communities of the future, which I think everybody in the room can see and envisage. But what are your own reflections on that?
For those that don't know me and those that do, I mean, I've been in the development industry for about 33 years. I've probably developed about 7,000 houses, most of which I can go back and I'm proud of, so that's a good thing. I look back at the complexities of how that has come about, good and bad, and learned lots of things about. And two things that always change is I've also been through 2 recessions, and all my good plans during those 2 recessions, those schemes had to start again and go back down to the fundamentals of viability and delivering things. Clearly, in hindsight, they actually didn't turn out too badly, but they were monumental differences because you have to change and be flexible. When I hear everyone, and you hear everyone in the different things, everyone has got really major things to add. When you're at the top of the tree, you tend to have to think, how do you bring all these things in and do them in the best way you can? And if you're socially responsible like I am, then you try and do the best you can in every area, but you can't make everyone happy. And it's a real balancing act, trying to think of the... Now, people who know me, I've always probably led the sustainability field, probably as arguably the most sustainable developer in the UK in many ways. So I've always pushed the boundaries. And in many ways, for many years, I felt like I was like Prince Charles because I was the only one ever doing anything. And I felt like a bit like a leper, I have to say, in many ways, because I don't think anyone appreciated it apart from local authorities and Homes England, and the rest of the people thought I was kind of mental in many ways, because why would you be doing all this stuff? It's costing more. Why do you do it? Why do you do it? Now, clearly, people are looking at it different. So you kind of persevere. So I look round and I think about all the things that we're all trying to aspire to, and to be honest, there's some fantastic ideas. And I think, you know, we just have to be able to try and look at what we can do, and also look at where we are in the country, because whatever everyone might think, viability is still the number one priority, because you can only deliver so many things, and that's it, and the land can only deliver X amount. So that's the big issue, is you've got to compromise, because you can't do everything. And clearly, like me, can say, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, can't do that. Of course, I'd love to do everything that we've talked about, but you can't. So it's trying to balance, and for everyone to realise that when you're looking at the whole master plan and delivering things, viability still has to be your number one priority, because if you can't make it work, then you can't deliver any housing, or you can't deliver any commercial, and you can't deliver anything else. So I kind of still think about that mostly.
And would you say, Carl, overall, are you optimistic that we can achieve these aspirations for communities of the future? Do you think we have the right frameworks in place?
I've kind of been involved in the housing, as I said. I've also built up a very large delivery mechanism with frameworks delivering in both hospitals and schools, sustainability-wise, both of which I've pretty much tried pretty every technology that is around today. And am I optimistic? I'm optimistic that I can, in Phoenix, which is my new company, and I've built together kind of all of the learnings that I've had over 30 years, both in housing and property and sustainability. And I now look at it in a very different way, because I built up joint ventures in all sorts of things with regard to smart homes, retrofit homes. I've developed my own flood risk house, both an elevating house and an elevated house. I'm involved in modular housing, tricky, but I am involved in that. I've done an awful lot of solar. I've probably built more solar in the UK than probably anyone. I've got joint ventures in wind technologies that I'm looking to bring forward. I'm involved in lots of water technologies, and so some of the stuff I've mentioned here, and I'm looking at how I can incorporate some of those within the nutrients debate, and looking at how we can hit the 110 litres per person per day, and even beat that, and trying to get people to use less water. And I've got involvement in biofuels, waste technology, so all of those. So trying to incorporate sustainability at the heart of what I do, Richard, and then make sure that those skills can be brought forward into new employment opportunities, because I think I can actually be at the leading edge of a lot of that stuff. I actually treat housing now almost at the back end as something that actually people will want me to deliver, rather than me have to, as I have done for 25 years, been asking people for it. I'm now thinking, well, if I do the other two, which is what I want to do, the housing will almost be alongside it to make a sustainable community, because you can't have one without the other, but I'm looking at it from a different... So yes, I'm optimistic that approach is a better approach than I've done all my career, which I've now changed in many ways, because I want to do it differently.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carl, very much indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we're going to draw things to a close now, if we may.
Thank you, Carl. Hopefully, is that one off now? Hopefully, a useful session. I thought it was very rich, lots of different viewpoints, some good challenge as well, and lots to think about. I think more than anything, you kind of come away thinking, gosh, there is so much to stitch together here. How does that task come about? One of the things that Trevor mentioned is the importance of networks, and hopefully there is something of a network forming here. This isn't the only workshop we're going to be holding. We're going to be holding another one in July where we're going to be looking very much at enterprise and skills and energy, and how we stitch all of those together. And that's the next one we've got planned. But perhaps there is real merit in bringing groups like this together again and again over the period of the next few months as we look at the local plans in both district, both Huntingdonshire and Peterborough, and perhaps beyond, so that actually we create those communities of interest. And it's not a developer forum, it's a forum with the community, it's a forum with the NGOs, it's a forum with all of those who have a stake in getting this right. So I hope you will come along to the next one and join us for that and be part of this debate as we take it forward. So can I thank our speakers very much indeed for taking the time to join us today and to stimulate us with their thoughts and their commentary, and thank you all very much indeed for joining us this evening and being part of what I thought was a really interesting and at times entertaining session.